Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh. Our co-host is John Dupuy. And our guest today is Keith Martin Smith, a remarkable man who has crammed several lifetimes into one incarnation. He's a business consultant, a martial arts master, a Zen priest and teacher, a mindfulness teacher. He's passionate about men's work and leads groups in that and has taught on it. And he's an award-winning author, most notably for his biography of the Zen teacher, Junpo Kelly. Name of the book is A Heart Blown Open, The Life and Practice of Junpo Kelly Roshi. And he's here today because about 6 months ago, I listened to a talk that he gave, and it just lit so many bulbs and made so much sense to me. Like so many of us, all of us, I think we're probably all very sympathetic to the values and aspirations of the diversity, equity, inclusion movement. And yet somehow this has become a major flashpoint in our culture, a bête noire for a lot of conservatives. There are Republican states banning it or excluding it from funding. And I think that although many of us are very sympathetic to it, we've also had this intuition that something's off. It's like, yeah, the values are great, but something's not quite working. And it certainly has riled up a lot of people. And Keith's talk just illuminated that and gave voice to some of the reservations and concerns that I'd had, and really made sense of this. John listened and agreed. And so today we have with us, Keith Martin Smith. And Keith, welcome. And perhaps we can start by just asking you how you became so deeply concerned and informed about this issue.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. So thank you for having me on the podcast. I first became interested in the DEI stuff, I think really just from the sidelines. I didn't have much personal experience in it. I work for myself. I'm not really involved in too many sort of institutional kind of settings. But I was watching what was going on, and I did get to see for a while, maybe 2016 through 2019, I was working for the spiritual teacher Reggie Ray, who's one of Chogyam Trungpa's sort of senior students, and he has an organization called Dharma Ocean, which is a Vajrayana organization. And I was shocked. I worked there through 2019, and then not long after, just maybe before COVID, I think it was late fall 2019. He essentially had a coup that rose up from within his organization, a very angry, very much DEI focused sort of center, and sort of stripped power from him. And they basically blew up the entire organization. And I found it really heartbreaking to see that happened. And Reggie and I had spoken a couple of times about what I saw in the organization, and what I thought he might do about it. And it was too little too late. And so I think sort of watching someone who I knew and respected, watching an organization get destroyed under the guise of progress, or equity or justice, or these sorts of things, seemed like a great tragedy to me.
Yeah. So, and as a result of obviously a lot of thought and study, you formulated what you call the 7 deadly sins of diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah.
And yes, and you point to some of the real problems. And yet what I and others have found so very attractive about what you're doing with this is it's birthed not out of an antipathy to DEI, but out of a deep concern and sharing of its values, but also a concern that somehow something's gone off the rails here.
Yeah, and I just want to put in, it's I too have struggled with this, and as you said in your talk that I listened to, that you've been progressive, considered yourself a progressive for a long time, and I have a confession to make. I voted for Ronald Reagan the first time. because I just come out of a kind of oppressive, not kind of an oppressive religious organization. And I listened to all the rhetoric about freedom. And I was going, yes, that's the most important thing. And then later on, I said, this is freedom for rich people. It doesn't go freedom for everybody else. And so I turned against it from my experiences in Latin America. Well, I didn't turn against it, but anyway, I never voted for him the second time. So yeah, and I've struggled with this. Very painful. As you said, these are very important values. And I was a child in the early 60s, and I remember sitting at the adults speaking about the civil rights movement and all this stuff, and I just sit there absorb it all. And I was pretty sure that this guy up there and his ilk were doing the right thing, and even when the adults said I was I didn't go along with it. You don't always go along with what you're brought up with. So it's very personal. And I think that one of the issues with this is so divisive. It separates us more. It's like the last thing on bloody earth we need is to be separated. We're so falling apart as a civilization, even as a culture, as a country. And I had dinner last night with a couple, very conservative, Christian couple, and the subject came up LGBTQ. Right, I hope I got that right. Anyway, and they don't get it. They just don't get it. And it's been kind of forced down their throats, and it's just, and so I tried to speak about it in a way that was, a way that was integral. And I talked to them on the level that they could receive it. And that, it's really, but we don't have to understand it. We just have to respect people and the different things they go through, And so anyway, so I think there's a real necessity of an integral consciousness that includes wisdom and compassion and empathy. And I think that's probably left off, and that was a rather long statement. So I'll turn it back to you, Keith. Sorry about that.
No problem. I mean, it's a point well taken, right? It's like if we're going to have these discussions, I love people like Jordan Peterson. I find him brave and bold what he does, but from an integral perspective, I would argue that I don't believe Dr. Peterson understands the postmodern view at all. I mean, not that he doesn't understand it a little bit. He doesn't understand it at all. Now, he understands it cognitively, of course, but I've never heard him argue for why it was a philosophical and practical necessity to have come up so strongly in the 20th century to really critique some of the edifices of modernism and rationality. He doesn't seem to appreciate that. And so people like him, their critique of DEI and of quote unquote wokeness really comes from a desire to tear it backwards, to dismantle it totally, and to dismiss that there's any truth claims whatsoever in what these groups and organizations are saying. And so, if I was to start anywhere, it would be exactly what you said, John, which is that, whenever I'm sitting with people who are strong proponents of DEI, the first thing I do is I get shared reality with them. And I talk about this idea that, for most of the 20th century, social justice was centered around what I would call concrete injustices. And by concrete, I mean there are things that exist in the physical world that you can see with the five senses, right? So what does that mean? That means denied to universities, whites only in universities. My dad graduated from University of Mississippi in 1959. There were no blacks allowed. It was overtly racist. There were white only water fountains.
That's right.
There was redlining in cities where blacks just weren't allowed to buy homes. The GI Bill, which put so much of the white population into the middle class, was
didn't include the blacks.
Denied the blacks, right?
Oh.
So this is what I call systematic racism as opposed to systemic racism. Systematic racism means it's overt, it's baked into things. The school systems that are built overtly on tax brackets so that the poorest areas have the crappiest schools, right? Because they have the least amount of money. All these things, systematic racism, these are all concrete. They can be seen really easily. I can point to you, and you can't really deny that they're there. You can argue why they should be there, but you can't deny they're there. So the first round of social justice, major social justice in the 20th century, was to address these overt, grotesque, concrete differences that had been forced upon people of color and on women as well. I can make the same argument. Women weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't open a bank account without their husband's co-signature. There were all sorts of sort of indignities that were being experienced by women as well, to say nothing of stealing credit from them and denying them admission into intellectual circles and belief that they weren't as smart as men and all these other things. These are all concrete things, and social justice in the 20th century did a really good job of naming them and pointing them out and showing where they were unjust. And this is the birth of the suffrage movement, first for women in the teens and 20s. And then, of course, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and then the women's liberation movement in the 70s. And I think we would say these were all fantastic things. I think any conservative would say these are fantastic things. And so we start there and say, okay, this was good and it was just and it was necessary. And then, so what's going on now is the question. And what's going on now is there's been an emergence in consciousness. There's been the idea of a post-rational point of view has differentiated and become part of the mainstream, certainly in university settings, academic settings, but really for a lot of other people as well. And with this move from rationalism to post-rationalism, there's a capacity to see, instead of just concrete things, I can see subtle objects as well, subtle objects of the mind that I can't see with my five senses. Another way to understand this that I think makes sense to people at the rational level, you can see cognitive bias really clearly. All rationalists know cognitive bias exists, and they know they have cognitive bias. So they set up double and triple blind experiments to protect themselves and protect other people from the biases that they know all humans carry. And what happens at the next developmental level, at this postmodern level, is it's seen that not only do we all have our own cognitive biases, but those cognitive biases knit together, and they form a large, you could say, a cultural cognitive bias, where in this subtle soup of an unseen field of culture, there might be a subtle downward opinion of people of color. And the example I give is this idea of like microaggressions, right? Which conservatives love to roll their eyes at microaggressions. But if we look at it from a steelman point of view, from what's correct here, what are they seeing that's true? If I walk into a coffee shop and I see a 6'5" black guy, and I walk up to him and say, hey man, do you play basketball? It seems innocent enough, right? Tall black guy. But the postmodernist would argue that my presumption that he is a basketball player and not a philosopher or a scientist or a brilliant engineer is evidence that there is a subtle soup of racism that's still afoot. There's a presumption of a lack of perhaps academic rigor or intellectual brilliance because he's a tall black man.
Well, also the question comes up: would you say the same thing if it was a 6'9" white guy?
You could argue that, yeah, you might, yeah.
I might, yeah.
Yeah, but the idea going from this sort of steelman argument here, right?
Yeah.
So what the postmodernists see is, okay, so there's this sort of cognitive bias, projected cultural bias that exists, and it creates these conditions, these assumptions based on race and gender, and that influences all kinds of things across culture: hiring, promotion, access to power, access to wealth. And these things, and this is the key point, these subtle cognitive biases are responsible for the inequality that we see in culture, that we see in society. And so they need to be torn down. And it's that second point, because I agree with the first point.
Yeah.
It's the second point that we could really spend some time pulling it apart.
Yeah.
And you've identified some of the key elements that go into this worldview and some of the excesses. Is there more you'd like to say about the worldview, the understanding, or should we dive into the excesses of DEI? What's the best way forward here?
Yeah, we could probably just go ahead and dive into it. I may circle back to point out where, like I said, I would like to talk about the proficient sides of these, but I'll just do that as it.
Yeah, you go wherever you want to go, Keith.
All right, great.
You're good, man.
Well, yeah. So let's step back and acknowledge again that you and I think all of us and probably all our listeners very much share the values underlying the diversity, equity, inclusion movement. That who have a good heart would not want to see the fullest range of human beings accorded the greatest dignity, etc. And the most equitable, fair treatment and outcomes. But then we run into the problems in both the implementation and the way in which some of these ideas have been deeply exacerbated or stretched or just deformed, I think would be not too unfair a word. So you ran through 7 of those. Perhaps you could just start with pointing at just naming the 7 7 distortions that you see.
Yeah, and they're all oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
No, I had one question that we can pay attention to as we go along. How much of this might be caused by people taking up a postmodern idea who have not achieved postmodernism at their own personal level and in their self-reflective consciousness? Because there's so many good things about green, how I experience with the compassion, loving nature, sure. Everybody's invited to the party, all this. But if you take it up at an amber or blue level and you take up that, kind of that dogma, it gets translated. I'm just, this is what I'm trying to feel out in a much more, perhaps, less mature and hurtful way.
Absolutely. So that's 100% correct, which I would just remind you too, that that's true for everything, right? So if we take rational and scientific truths and we go down half a developmental step down to like what Ontario Fallon's model and Suzanne Cook-Reuter's model is the expert phase, which is like early rationalism, like just out of amber. Scientific truths from that worldview, that's scientism. That's when I believe in science as an absolute truth, which is actually an irrational point of view. And that's when you'll find people that are like hardcore atheist, right? It's like, there is no God, and it's like, well, how do you prove a negative? The position is deeply irrational. So the same thing happens with DEI, where these green meme, postmodern, very complex discernments of reality can very much get collapsed into this expert phase, this pre-rational phase. And what you see there is that one of the hallmarks of that worldview is that they cannot take any criticism of any kind. They're absolutely reactive to any sort of criticism. And most importantly, where you can tell someone is there is they don't have facts, they have their facts. And if you, John, come to me and I'm in this expert phase of consciousness arguing for DEI stuff, and you say, hey, I have a bunch of really interesting data that might change your mind a little bit, I'm going to say, no. I don't need to read. I'm sure your data is biased, because I have this huge cognitive bias as an expert that I can't see. It's unconscious. Cognitive bias only comes online when you actually are genuinely fully rational. So these are hugely relevant. In my opinion, a lot of the culture wars that we're seeing around this are fueled by people who are actually at an early rational stage, whether they are pro or con DEI, but that's where all the punches are being thrown, right? That's where all the vitriol is coming from online and trolling and people just so angry about it as opposed to willing to sit down and talk about it.
Okay, and you have been willing to sit down and talk about it.
I have been.
So
at some personal cost, I might add.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Bless you. Bless you. So back to maybe just start with listing the 7 deadly sins.
So the 7 are, the first one is a simplistic view of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Second one is undiverse diversity. Third one is intolerant tolerance. Fourth is the equality of outcomes approach. The fifth one is an obsession with oppression and power. The sixth one is tribalism. And the final one is anti-liberalism.
Okay, well, we have enough there to keep us entertained for a while. So let's start with privilege, because this is clearly a central theme in a number of the movements of our time, diversity, equity, inclusion for sure, but also in critical theory, critical race theory, another totally hot button topic, which actually relates to this.
Very much so.
So So maybe, yeah, tell us your take on
Yeah.
privilege and the way that's understood and misunderstood.
Yeah. What is privilege, right? So privilege is the idea that some people or groups of people have access to power, money, education, uh, uh, and cultural mobility in a way that other groups do not.
An intact family too, I think you said in one of your prior
Yeah.
talks that really, really
Yeah.
resonated with me.
So we would all agree that, I mean, anyone who's paying attention would agree that, people of color, um, uh, LGBTQ people, women, that historically they have been denied privilege. I mean, that's undeniably true if you go back, 100 years, 50 years. So you're just not paying attention if you say that that's not true. But here we are in 2024, and so we start to have these discussions. Well, what is privilege? And the big thing that DEI focuses on is race and sex, and then to a lesser degree gender. So race, of course, sex, male, female, gender, across the spectrum of gender identification. That's where they put their emphasis. And so I have a lot of critiques of this. So if you're just going to focus on these concrete things like this, then my argument is we really need to be talking about three more things because the data so strongly backs them up. The first one is class.
Yes.
The idea that class, if you are the children of the comedian Chris Rock or Barack Obama's daughters, your race and your gender aren't really that relevant because you have so much access to money and institutional power. The idea that they're disenfranchised is absurdist, right? So the idea of class is equally as important as these other three things. A fourth one that's vital is education. Every study, and I have a lot of studies that I've looked at, but every study shows that the single greatest determination, regardless of race or gender, of income potential is education. Period. Okay. And then the final one that's really important with this is family of origin. The idea of do you come versus a one parent or a two parent home. These are hugely important. So one statistic, for instance, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the poverty rate for single parents with children is 37.1%. So the poverty rate for single parents with children is almost 40%. That rate for married couples with children, 7%. 40% versus 7%. That's one thing. And so we talk about privilege and we don't talk about that. I mean, that's crazy and it's lazy and it's not helpful. To say it another way, if I'm a Black man and I come from a two-parent home, both of my parents went to Harvard and have PhDs, I'm going through medical school, I'm very smart, will I have some institutional systemic racism? There'll be some, but I have high class education, wealth, a two-parent home. The cards are not stacked against me. And to put that man next to a man that was raised in a one-family home in the inner city, denied education, didn't finish high school, just to collapse it to the color of their skin is overtly racist and ineffective. So that would be the sort of meta argument there. And I would only add in for other subtleties, these are the concrete ones, these big five that I talked about, right? Race, gender, sex, education, class, and family, one or two family home. But we could talk about all kinds of other things. I mean, there's attractiveness, there's body weight ratio, there's there's height. 80% of CEOs are 6 feet 2 or taller. So, are
personality? Yeah.
Personality, right? Yeah. The big five personality traits, like in the West, assertiveness and, all these things that are like, you look at CEOs, they all have the same psychograph when it comes to the big five personality traits. And those successful leaders in Japan have a very different psychological profile. Yeah. So I'll pause there and see if you guys have any questions.
Yeah,
well,
no, go ahead,
John.
Okay, I have a kind of turning this on its head. I came from a very privileged background. Maybe not that I'm that brilliant or anything, but I had intact parents, upper middle class in the 60s, when the country was rocking, Encyclopedia Britannica, at access, and, was educated in foreign schools in Mexico with people from all over the world. So much privilege, a white guy, straight, however you want to put that. And my question becomes then, have I given enough back? Noblesse oblige. If you're given a lot, you're expected to give a lot. And my questions becomes, given all that, have I been a good man? Have I served? And how could I have done better and still do with the time left that's allotted to me?
Let me run on that, John, or expand it, because I think it's what Zen would call a Genjo koan. It's a koan that life itself has given you and me and all of us here, I think, what to do with our good fortune and privilege. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Keith, because I haven't been around a lot of the DEI stuff, but I've been exposed to enough of it to see some of the dysfunction, and I've certainly read enough about the dysfunction. But one thing that becomes very apparent is if you're in a group talking about race, and it becomes clear that as for example, a white male, there's a kind of expectation the appropriate response is guilt.
Absolutely. Or shame, which is much more pervasive, I think.
So I've wrestled for a long time with, well, what are actually, and guilt is not guilt and shame are not skillful emotions. I think of guilt as regret plus self-attack, which is not a recipe for psychological health. So I've wrestled with the question, what are healthy responses and attitudes to privilege? And the best I've come up with are four things. One is exactly what John said, is contribution. Second one is gratitude. It's just it's okay to feel grateful for one's good fortune and the good fortune of others.
And it's necessary.
Yes.
A third is humility, recognizing that my privilege is due to so many factors beyond my personal responsibility or anything I've done. Being born in the right time at the right place with good health, good genes, etc. It's an endless list of gifts that have been given me. And yet, if we look at the research on privilege and wealth, for example, people who have privilege and wealth tend to overemphasize their own role in producing it. So, and overestimate the extent to which people less privileged situations can control their circumstances. So gratitude, contribution, humility, and fourth, recognizing it's not going to last. It's ephemeral.
Yeah. Even if you make it all the way to the end, still got to give it up at the end of the show, right?
Yeah. So do you have any other things you would add?
Beautifully said, Roger, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing. I would add on to that, because I think, we're speaking from sort of three white men here. And so, there's maybe a well-earned sensitivity to the things that we have that enables a conversation like this. I would turn it slightly on its head and move this a little more into a critique of DEI, from the sense of three of the most prominent proponents of the DEI worldview are Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ibram X. Kendi, and Robin DiAngelo. And I did a little digging on them, for the first time I did this. And all three of them, so Nicole Hannah-Jones, who wrote the 1619 Project for the New York Times, and she's now a tenured professor at Howard University. She's worth about $3 million. She has a master's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She came from a middle-class family with a two-parent home. And yet all she has mostly talked about is how rigged the system is against Black women, which there's truth. But to your point, Roger, what she has never admitted that I've heard is gratitude for how much access to privilege and power that she has. She wrote a huge piece for the New York Times. She won a Pulitzer Prize, for God's sakes. She's worth millions of dollars. And what I see is she talks about how hard it is and how much he's had to overcome, which sounds like a lot of the white people that I know who, through a lot of their own privilege, talk about how hard it was and how much they've overcome when they do exactly what you're not doing, which is expressing gratitude for all the things that are actually there. So what I see sometimes in the DEI space is for the people that are up on the stage, so to speak, lecturing us about our privilege are themselves incredibly privileged, but they don't talk about class. They don't talk about their family of origin where they had two middle-class parents that loved them and educated them. And they don't talk about their net worth and how much money they make doing these things. And so they come from a place of talking down to those who they call privileged without acknowledging their own privilege and leading by example and saying, hey, I'm a Black woman, and a lot of Black women don't have the opportunities that I had because I'm unbelievably privileged. I'm educated. My parents love me. I'm worth a hell of a lot of money. And I want to talk about the women that didn't have access to this kind of privilege. That's not the story we're being told. It's, I'm a Black woman. I'm suffering because I don't have access to power, hard stop. And that's where I call BS on this whole DEI conversation. If we're willing to tell the truth, the three of us, everyone that's talking about this space should be willing to tell the truth about their background and their income and their education at a minimum, to say nothing of their intelligence, which is another marker of success, or their attractiveness, another marker of success. I could go on, but, yes, I think having the humility to talk about what we have so that we can be grateful and humble is vital to this discussion.
Yeah, just one reflection on your point about class, basically income. It's interesting that Marxism was described as the intellectual opiate of the opiate of the intellectuals, but it also had had good points. And its main point and its main problem was it emphasized class above everything else. And now that whole emphasis, as you say, has been not only neglected, it's been very much neglected. And somehow it feels like, well, the poor aren't, in one sense, aren't being, across the board, aren't getting the support they need from the DEI movement.
I mean, absolutely. How fair is it that a white guy raised in a trailer park in West Virginia
Right.
by a single mom who's addicted to meth, that he has a harder time getting into Harvard because of his skin color than a Black guy who has two PhD parents that went to Harvard, who went to boarding school his whole life. But Harvard is going to tend to look at this silly reductionistic idea of privilege, which is race, gender, sex. And they're getting better. They're getting a little more nuanced in looking at class and cultural background, but not enough, in my opinion. And to your point, Roger, I would say, there's been a lot of ink spilled over the last bunch of years, ever since the George Floyd stuff of police killing Black men. And it's gotten really distorted. And, for anybody that's willing to actually look at the data, it's really interesting, which I haven't pulled up here, but the truth is that it's in the highest poverty areas, regardless of race, where the most people get killed. In other words, cops kill poor people most often. So in the lowest poverty areas, so in the richest areas, 1.8 people per million get killed by police. In the poorest areas, 6.4 million get killed by police. So there's a 3.5 times difference between police killings between a poor neighborhood and a rich neighborhood, regardless of race, right? Regardless of race. And while we do find discrepancies in racial killings, that poor Blacks get killed more often than poor whites, what we're not talking about anywhere near enough is that the problem with police killings is they're killing poor people.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
And I might add to that because I'm living in a small city in the South that has, statistic-wise, one of the most violent cities in America. Not my particular neighborhood, but it's there. And poor people kill poor people much more than cops kill poor people, and that needs to be talked about too. And I'm in agony thinking about how I can help, what can I do, to try to break this up, this generational thing that gets passed on, and just keeps replicating itself. It's a wicked problem. And if anybody has any ideas, I have ideas, but I certainly haven't worked it out.
Well, we have to start by telling the truth. We have to start by telling the truth that the number one cause of death between Black men between the ages of 18 and 45, the single greatest killer, is murder. And who's killing them? Not cops. They're being killed in their own communities. That fact, and it is a fact, is very inconvenient to the DEI narrative because they don't really want to look at that. It's an ugly truth because they're afraid it will imply something racist, which it doesn't. It implies something about education and opportunity and poverty and desperation, which we should be trying to fix rather than trying to ignore and focusing instead on police violence, which should be focused on, but and not at the expense of focusing on things that are having a far greater impact on young men's lives.
What I hear in the way you're approaching this, Keith, is you're approaching it, trying to approach our social issues and poverty and inequality, etc., in a very practical, informed, open-minded, informed way, and not coming out of a preconceived dogma, which I appreciate. And that feels really important. Show me the facts, and the truth will set you free, in a sense. Hopefully, anyway.
Yeah.
So, okay, so deep appreciation then for the way you're taking a more nuanced, open-minded approach to these issues, and doing it out of compassion, really wanting a more equitable society. And so you have a more nuanced understanding of privilege. And the second thing you point to is the way that diversity is. The problematic ways in which diversity is treated by the diversity, equity, inclusion movement.
Yeah. And this is pretty straightforward, but we all see that when they talk about diversity, they're talking about diversity of skin color and genitalia, not of ideas or ideologies. So when people in Boulder say, Boulder needs to be more diverse, what they mean is we need more Black people that think like I think. That's the truth of what they mean. What they don't mean by diversity is, we need a bunch of people that support Trump and are willing to fly their rebel flags, unafraid. That's diverse. That's really diverse if you want diversity. And so they have this idea of diversity, which is really ideological purity with dark skin, light skin, female genitalia, non-binary genitalia, whatever it is, but it's a bit of a caricature. So that's one thing. And then the limited view of diversity, when we get into higher education and we look at the university settings and what's happened over the last 20 years, it is a little bit alarming if you're a conservative. Now, I'm not a conservative. I'm a lifelong far left liberal progressive. At least I was 20 years ago. Now I've been somehow placed, sometimes on the right of these issues, which boggles my mind. But coming from a traditional liberal progressive standpoint, you look at higher education and the Democrat versus Republican that are registered in university settings. In the STEM fields, it's 4 Democrats to 1 Republican, which is, that's still unbiased, but it's not terrible. But in psychology and philosophy, it's 11 to 1, 11 Democrats to 1 Republican. In the administration, it's 12 to 1. In English and sociology, it's 28 to 1. And in anthropology, where a lot of this DEI stuff is coming from, it's 42 Democrats to 1 Republican. And they have the audacity to talk about diversity. I would argue that a lot of these folks don't really want diversity. As I said, they want more people with dark skin so they can feel better about themselves, but they don't want a conservative in there. Conservative kids end up going to more Christian colleges, and they head off to places like think tanks where they're welcome, because they're not welcome in university settings anymore. So, that's just one view of a reality that's happening that is really creating the reality distortion field that we're encountering as a lot of these kids come out of these incredibly liberal universities and into the world with very undiverse points of view of the world. They can't appreciate that conservatives aren't fascist, and that, Republican points of view have validity to them, even if you don't agree with them. They could never steelman a conservative talking point because they're not taught to. That's not diversity.
And let's see, you've also talked about, well, let me just ask, I vaguely remember somewhere that in developmental terms, and I know you have a great deal of knowledge on adult psychological development, Keith, that this kind of appreciation or valuing of concrete diversity tends to come online before an appreciation, open-mindedness to different points of view. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I said, at the top of this call. The first thing that we can see developmentally is concrete racism, which is, the idea of overt whites only drinking fountains. And then after that, then we can see these, subtler forms of racism and sexism.
I saw that as a kid, by the way. That's a real lived experience for me.
Oh, yeah.
Different waiting rooms. I mean, I was there. I saw it.
Yeah. And what happens is, I remember I read an article a few years ago by a professor here at CU who I couldn't believe it, but he said, I'm trying to figure out what's worse. The KKK marching down the street, or the microaggressions that I experience every day. And I thought to myself, wow, you're wondering which one's worse. Talk about a privileged and arrogant point of view. Because I grew up having the goddamn KKK march down my street, and I can tell you which one's worse without any question. And I understand his point was that, well, I'd rather have racism in my face because I can see it. But it's almost a comical distortion of not understanding that someone that wants to put a burning cross on your front lawn is a lot more threatening than someone who asked you if you like rap. The second one is just ignorant. The first one is overtly hostile and concretely
malicious,
threatening.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and physically dangerous. So yeah, so that's, and then I would just add, as far as this diversity thing, there's one other really important point, which is that if we pull income on Asian Americans, and we look at Asian Americans are earning somewhere around, on average, their median income for 2022 was about $110,000, $111,000 a year. Whites are about $82,000, $83,000 a year. So Asians are out earning whites by a lot, and earning by far more than anyone else in a racial group in the United States. And because of that, now Asians are a minority, they are not a majority of people in this country. And yet, because they're doing well financially and culturally, they are excluded from conversations about diversity. It's like Asians don't exist. So, we've all read and seen the things that, if Harvard actually admitted people based on their qualifications, it would have like 60% Asian population, but they don't want Asians there. And so there's this, we're talking about diversity, but because Asian people are doing well, they're not minorities anymore. They're like white people. They just look a little different. And so it gets back to this question of, what are we talking about when we're talking about diversity? What do you mean? What are the criteria that you're using if you say you want a more diverse workplace, what does that mean? And why? Why does it matter?
And what are the Asians doing that the rest of us aren't?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to this idea of privilege, right? It's like, if you look at the statistics, much more likely to come from a two-family home of educated parents and themselves get educated, which are the hallmarks of people who do best culturally.
How are we doing on our 7 deadly sins list, Keith?
We're on 2. We're up to number 3, which is intolerant tolerance. I just got to that. This is a short one.
Okay.
Should I fire right into it?
Oh,
Okay.
Full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes.
So intolerant tolerance. So, I love to tell the story of when Trump was elected in 2016, there was the Million Woman March. And it was this grassroots organization that came up and they said, there's this misogynist now at the helm of the country, and women are going to stand up and we're going to show our power as a grassroots organization. We're going to demonstrate that together, we won't allow a misogynistic bully to blah, blah, blah. And it was powerful, right? The marches happened. It was covered by the media. I thought, wow, this might really be a real thing that's happening here. And within 2 years, the Million Woman March had completely collapsed in on itself because of this, what I would say, intolerance, this intolerant tolerance, this idea that they were not able to keep themselves from fighting among themselves about who deserved to run the organization and who was the most oppressed. The Black women were fighting the Jewish women, were fighting the white women, and it devolved into lawsuits and acrimony, and the Million Woman March split apart and basically doesn't exist anymore. So they weren't able to stay organized enough to fight a common enemy, which was Trump, because of their intolerance for people unlike themselves. It's a great example to me. Intolerance, this idea that DEI sometimes teaches around white fragility and systemic racism. These are highly intolerant points of view. White fragility is just like what Freud used to argue when people used to say, Dr. Freud, we think your theory is a little sex obsessed, that like what makes up the complexity of a human being might be a little bit more than just sexual drives. And he would say, that's because you're sexually repressed. Right? It was just like, it was a brilliant non-argument. He would just dismiss the person as being sexually repressed so he wouldn't have to deal with whatever the argument was. And this intolerance in DEI does the same thing if they accuse someone of having white fragility, or they go to these like really sort of funny things where they'll say, well, a woman that's arguing against some of the DEI tenets, she has internalized patriarchy or internalized misogyny, which is, talk about arrogant, but it's an intolerance for any views that are unlike themselves, and an intolerance to take in criticism and have honest debate. And it's
just to clarify this a bit, what is white fragility? What are they saying?
So white fragility is the idea, the argument is that, I'm so blind, because I'm a white man, I'm so blinded by the culture of whiteness in which I was raised and all of the micro privileges and macro privileges it's given me. And it's so part of the water in which I swim that anyone pointing out that I have privilege causes this fragility around me refusing to look at my privilege and acknowledge it. That's basically the argument.
Great, thank you.
And there could be truth. There could be a kernel of truth in it, right?
Yeah. And as I understand it, the idea comes from Robin DiAngelo, who has worked very much on racism, and as far as I can see, she I would label her approach, the way she works, as extremely unskillful psychologically. It comes close to attack therapy.
She's a bully.
Very strong attack on whites, particularly for their privilege and for failing to acknowledge and recognizing it. And when there's any reactivity to that, what feels like strong attack, that is quotes white fragility, and one should shut up and just listen. And if there's anything we've learned about psychological transformation, change, and growth, it's that if you want someone to change, if you want to give them help them to grow and to heal, you make it safe for them.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the opposite of the kind of atmosphere that's set up in Robin DiAngelo's workshops. And I have not done them. I have no desire to do them, but I've certainly read a lot about them. And it sounds very anti-therapeutic, anti-healing, and
it's intolerant. I mean, that's the whole that's the whole third point. DEI can be intolerant. Robin DiAngelo is intolerant of any viewpoint that isn't in lockstep with her own. And if you try to disagree with her, she will accuse you of white fragility and systemic internalized racism. So anything you say to her, she's going to dismiss because she's going to say you're an unconscious racist. And any disagreement proves that even more. So shut up and listen to me and do what I tell you. That is the sum total of her position. I mean, it's laughably anti-intellectual, anti-liberal, and it's the opposite of anti-fragile. It's completely fragile. You know, she can't tolerate a disagreeing point of view without doing an ad hominem attack on the person that's offering it.
And this has come up a couple of times. I want to step back and see and just see if we can name this process. You gave the example of Freud using his theory to dismiss counter arguments, and same thing certainly seems to happen with Robin DiAngelo, from what I read about her and I've read of her work. I seem to remember there's a name for this process when one uses one's own theory or worldview as to dismiss and assimilate another person's differing perspective. Is it assimilation? I can't remember.
I'm not
anyway,
sure.
but it's a very important concept.
Well, and integralists can do it too, right? I mean, I've encountered a few
absolutely.
integralists who say, hey, you know, it's not an integral point of view, therefore I can dismiss it, right? So it's not like I'm just picking on DEI people. This is a universal human problem.
Yeah, well, yeah,
And
good point.
As we said earlier, you know, you get people that espouse postmodern ideology who have not gone there emotionally or spiritually, you know, developmentally. It's just an intellectual stance for them. And I think that's been one of the big problems I've seen anyway in our intellectual Cosa Nostra, you know, this intellectual integral thing that we've done, is that people get the intellectual part before they, you know, they've successfully gone through traditional and then the postmodern, the opening the heart, the different perspectives, introspection, and all that. And it becomes, and we've been criticized for it, rightfully so. You know, to be integral, it's more than just an intellectual stance.
Yeah. Well, and to me, this, and I think I can end this point on intolerance on this point, because I think it's really vital that, you know, those of us that have the privilege to sit here and have these conversations, including the people of color and women that are up talking to us about privilege, right? That is itself a very privileged position. Those of us that have this privilege, it's incumbent upon us to really hold it with so much humility and a genuine doubt, right? That it's like, I am not here to take anybody down or to prop up my views. This is offered with a genuine humility of trying to offer something that might bring peace between us rather than more conflict. But I don't know, you know, I'm not trying to tear any of these things down. The goal of this is to be, you know, we're all struggling in the dark here, you know, if we take a step back, right? We're all imposing this human view onto this infinite arising of reality. Everything that we do, everything that we offer is in some ways a construct. It's in some ways, it's pretty far removed from reality, from the truth of existence. And so holding that is so important to these conversations so we can be humble and listen, genuinely listen, right? Because I could be wrong. Tomorrow I could talk to some DEI person. I'm going to go, holy shit, you know, I never thought of it from that point of view. And I hope I would have the ears to hear.
Yeah, and hopefully we're all works in progress in that way. And you said were ready to close on your discussion of intolerance within the DEI movement, but I do want to ask you to speak about one thing you have spoken to in the past, and that's the purity tests that now operate in a lot of organizations in which you have to basically toe the line to DEI, otherwise you don't get hired.
Well, this is a real problem, and it should really be concerning to anybody who hears this, which is it appears that in a number of universities across the country, and to a lesser degree workplaces, but especially in the university settings, in order to get into things like master's and PhD programs, and certainly to places like Naropa here in Boulder, you have to do things like talk about, admit where you contribute to racism and sexism in the culture and what you're going to do to address it. And there are these ideas that you have to accept that these things that we've been talking about are all true, unquestionably true. And you have to say how you have been and are willing to fight them. And there's no room to have these kinds of discussions that we're having now. That would just mean you won't get hired. And the fact that we have physicists and mathematicians and chemists and engineers being required to jump through these anthropological hoops to prove that they understand these concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion is not that different from a McCarthy era kind of a thing. Convincing me, Roger, John, convince me you're not a communist. Or you're not going to get the job, and the thing to say, well, I think you're overreacting. I don't think there are commies everywhere. There was no freedom to have that discussion, and there's no freedom to have a discussion for someone, going into Berkeley to get their PhD, like, hey, I think this is a bit of a tempest in a teapot, and I have a philosophical and ethical and personal objection to some of these policies. I would love to talk about them, right? Not going to happen. Intolerant.
Yeah. And again, so much of this coming out of idealistic motives, but motives can get subverted, particularly if they become, what should we say, if they become unrealistic ideals, and the revolution eats its own, as the saying goes, and it feels like the tests for purity get more, well, the tests for purity get more and more refined and demanding in some ways. So anyway, I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around this, but maybe you could move on and tell.
Well, let me make one more point about
please.
Intolerance, because I do think it's important, which is that, I work for myself, right? But if I am not being hyperbolic or far right reactive at all when I say this, that if I worked for Google or Meta or Apple, there is no effing way that I could be having this discussion with you. I would absolutely lose my job, 100%. If I was a high school teacher here in Boulder or a college professor at CU, and I was having this discussion with you guys and it got out, I would 100% lose my job. Now, I haven't said anything that's racist or sexist or misogynistic or homophobic, but I am not toting the party line here. And you can see the intolerance in the undeniable truthfulness of that fact.
Yeah, that's painful statement.
Yeah, it's frightening.
Okay, well, on to your fourth thing, maybe.
All right.
I'm still kind of reeling from that a little bit.
Yeah, let's check it. You're doing really good, brother. Just keep it up. It's going great.
Right.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, so this one is the one that I probably have the most passion around, and I have the most data around. So this one may take me a little longer to get through. So let me sort of, I've got 4 points here. I'll pause after each one and see what the discussion brings up. But so the fourth one is an overemphasis on oppression and power. So from this DEI worldview, the sort of meta view is that as we move into postmodernism, right, you could argue it begins with Immanuel Kant and then goes to Nietzsche and then goes up through the French deconstructionalist, right, Derrida and Foucault and all these things. And in a nutshell, what happens? It's that the postmodernists deconstruct meaning, and they sort of take meaning out of the world. They say that the big three no longer exist. They kill God. And they see correctly developmentally that reality is socially constructed, that everything that we have is basically made up by human beings. And then their conclusion is that therefore there is no meaning in the world. And the only thing left that's real, according to like Derrida and Foucault, is power and power dynamics. And this is the basis of critical race theory. So critical race theory maintains that the world operates on principles of power and oppression, and they're always existent. They're always at play. And any time that you see a difference between the haves and the have-nots, it's always an equation of power. So I would argue that that is often at play. That is sometimes certainly at play, but it is never always at play. And so I'll unpack that a little bit. Is that clear, though, just that sort of meta view?
Yeah, well,
so.
and maybe it's worth our while stepping back a little and just looking at the general principle you're presenting here, Keith, and you're saying that that underlying the almost monomania about power that underlies critical theory and DEI, and they're very closely related. This comes, of course, from Foucault. His, was sometimes described as power mad. He really saw everything in terms of power, much in the way Freud saw so much of the psyche in terms of sex. And I think it'd be valuable for us to step back and just have a little bit of a meta discussion about this tendency, which seems innate, to focus on a single dynamic or cause. I call it the single cause fallacy, and assume that almost everything can be explained in terms of that.
That's right.
Along with that, there's the fallacy of, if we understand that human behavior, both individual and collective, is the result of a myriad causes, umpteen factors and dynamics going on internally, externally, interpersonally, socially, culturally, etc., then it becomes clear that the focus on just one factor is going to be limited and limiting. But also, if you set out to find what you're looking for, either power dynamics or sexual dynamics,
cognitive bias
and expectancy factors, you're probably going to find it, because it usually is operating, but it's one of only umpteen factors.
Absolutely. And so I want to, that's a great place for me to dive into this overemphasis on oppression and power, because this makes up so much of the problem of DEI. Excuse me. So I always like to start off, and someone else brought this up. It may have been Peterson. I can't remember. This isn't my example, but it's a brilliant example. The idea of Kenyans and marathons, and the idea that since 1960, when they first entered marathons on a large scale, Kenyans have dominated marathons. They win at some ridiculous percentage of them. They win year after year. And the Kenyans that run are 3% of the Kenyan population. So it's like basically like it's a village that all these elite runners come from. And they dominate. Year after year, they dominate. And, they found lots of reasons. There are genetic reasons, in the way their blood processes oxygen and whatever else. There's environmental reasons because of the altitude at which they train. And there's cultural reasons in the way that they value running and speed and all these other things. And all of these things, sort of like these constellations, come together, these multipolar factors, and help to explain why Kenyans dominate marathons. Okay, easy example. But if we were looking at this through a DEI viewpoint, the fact that I even suggested that genetics, environment, and culture are causing Kenyans to dominate at the expense of everybody else, I would be labeled as X, Y, and Z. This intolerance we've already spoken of would come online, and I would be thrown out of my ear. And to give you an example, a very concrete example, in 2005, the then president of Harvard looked at the disparity in the STEM fields, and that 20% of people in STEM were female. And he had the audacity to suggest that it could be three things or more. It could be because women left the field to go for things like motherhood and pregnancy and marriage, and that interrupted their career paths and made it harder for them to get back into the field. So in other words, it could be because of the choice of women. It could be because women chose the STEM fields at 20% the rate that men chose them. So it could be the free and open choice of women. And the third reason, he said, could be because of sexism. And then he went on to say that, and there could be even more reasons that are going on here that we don't know about, but we need to study it because we need more women in STEM to help broaden blah, blah, blah. Well, that was 2005. He was fired a year later for having the audacity to suggest it could be anything but number three, that sexism and oppression could be the only thing at play. So this gets to a really interesting fact. 2005, so almost a generation ago now, 20% of the people in STEM were women. And now we've had 20 years of this fact. And today, 2024, 20% of the people in STEM are women. It has gone up not a single percentage point, despite a lot of people fighting this oppression and sexism that they believe exists. So there's only two explanations for why it hasn't actually changed, right? One is because the sexism and misogyny is so pervasive that it just can't be overcome. And the second reason is because maybe women aren't that interested in choosing STEM fields. And it's interesting too, when you look at the fact that 20% of graduates in the STEM fields from universities, undergraduates, postgraduate, 20% of the graduates are female and 80% are male. And what do we have in the working environment? 20% are female and 80% are male. Now, some would argue that there's not a problem here, actually, right? Because when we look at healthcare and we see that that is directly reversed. 80% of the people coming and working in the healthcare field now are women and 20% are men. And yet no one is accusing the healthcare profession of being guilty of oppression and power to explain the differential in male versus female practitioners, because that would be stupid and absurdist. And yet they apply that to the other side. So we're in this hilarious sort of hypocrisy where critical race theory gets applied to half of the world, but doesn't get applied to the other half of the world, where then things can sort of be seen more clearly for things like the free and open choice of the sexes. So let me pause there, and then we can go into some other interesting things.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a lot to say on this topic, so.
Oh, okay, go for it.
All right. So, there's been
well, let me just keep
yeah.
one thing you didn't mention, and maybe you were planning on it, but it's such an important point. You have elsewhere pointed out that in Scandinavian countries, which are
yes.
probably the world's most egalitarian and have tried most to undo any oppressive forces of any kind, things are pretty much the same, aren't they?
No, they're even more extreme. So what makes the Scandinavian countries fascinating is, yeah, they've done more than any other country to try to obliterate the cultural reasons why men or women might choose, say, engineering over nursing. And what they have found is that the stratification has gotten much stronger than it is in the United States. So it's something like 19-1 people in the healing professions are women. And something like 19-1 of the healing profession of the STEM fields are men. It's become radically polarized along sex lines in a culture that's done the most to obliterate the cultural reasons why people might feel like they're forced to choose one of those professions. So it just.
I'm sorry. Are they recognizing in Sweden or Denmark or what country you're talking about that there's a basic difference between men and women? And is that possible to say that? I mean, or masculinity and femininity, I should say, and that affects people's choices of careers and which direction they want to go.
Yeah. Well, what they are is they're confronted with the unpleasant fact, and it is a fact that the sexes are different.
Yeah,
Men. I don't know if you know this, John, but men and women are actually different. You know, it's like
I've noticed.
for a
I've
number
tried to
of reasons.
investigate that. Yeah.
Now, so, and I have a whole nother talk on this in Integral Life called "What is a Man?" But I don't want to get too far down this road. But you know, sex is a binary. There's a bunch of silly pseudoscience that's coming out that's trying to say sex isn't a binary. But even if you take their most aggressive and probably highly inaccurate statistics, you're still looking at 98% of human births are binary masculine, a male, female. Taking the most aggressive one. Now, if you look at more scientific stuff by the NIH, it's more likely that 99.8% of human births are male or female. But either way, even if it's 98%, that still means sex is a binary. I mean, you can't plot that on a bell curve because there aren't enough variables. It's a binary thing. So sex is a binary, hard stop. There's no scientific argument for the other way. Gender is an infinite expression, right? I could look like this and identify as a female or non-binary or whatever I want. That's a very, very different discussion and something that we could spend a lot of time talking about. But I'm getting off topic.
Yeah. So keep going. Power and oppression. We've got
Okay. So this idea of Kenyans and marathoners. So things. This is how ridiculous things are getting. So Scientific America was it's being run by a woman who's been really widely criticized by people like Steven Pinker, the philosopher, and some other people as having a quote unquote sort of woke agenda, and really taking the magazine into this like extreme DEI worldview. And I didn't know any of that. So in December of this past year, 2023, I picked up a Scientific American, was reading it, and there was a quote that just astounded me in the magazine. This is Scientific America. It's been around since like 1849 or something, right? It had a very, very good reputation for most of its existence. And the quote from this December 2023 article was that the inequality between male and female athletes is a result not of biological differences between the sexes, but of biases of how they are treated in sports. I couldn't believe when I read that. So that statement is actually 100% factually wrong. It is an absolute ideological statement, and it's an idiotic ideological statement, and it's easy to prove wrong. And I won't bore you guys with the statistics, but I will say that anyone who's interested can go to Duke Law's website, so dukelaw.edu/sports, and they've compiled reams of data that shows that in track and field events, men dominate in every field with no exceptions, and men just don't dominate women in every field in field and track. The best women in the world cannot beat the best teenagers in the world, the best teenage males in the world. So the best grown female women get obliterated by basically 16 and 17-year-old boys. To say that this is because of biases in how they're treated in sports is laughably incorrect and shows how much this overemphasis on oppression and power has gone when Scientific America is making a claim like this. I mean, it's radically reckless and irresponsible to put that into people's heads.
And to nuance it, Keith, which you do so well, we could probably all agree that some percentage of the variability, a few percentage, might be due to differential treatment of the sexes.
Sure.
But those are, by comparison with the biological differences, the muscle building power of testosterone, et cetera, I mean, it's just those biological factors swamp cultural factors and sporting opportunity factors.
And that's why it's such a hot topic issue with, generally kind of rationalists and scientists on one side saying that, hey, we don't want to exclude trans women from sports necessarily. Like, we don't want to say they can't do anything. That doesn't feel very fair. But it's also not very fair to biologically to biological women to allow someone who's born with a biologically male body to come in and compete at a high collegiate or high professional level, because they're going to kick ass. I mean, that's just the bottom line at the top level. Now, if it's an amateur game, if it's a softball game down at the local, the softball field, like, it doesn't matter there, like it doesn't matter with me. If I'm playing with tennis with somebody, I'm terrible. Anybody's going to beat me, no matter what their sex or gender or anything else is, or their age for that matter. But at the highest levels, these things become really important because they can be discriminatory towards women in a way that's towards biological women in a way that's really just not fair.
And another issue politically and culturally is it's obviously so ridiculous. I grew up in the South where American football is a religion, it's just
For sure.
It's big time. And try to think of female offensive lines or tackles or defense, it's insane. But so the right wing grabs onto these ridiculous belief systems of the progressive element or the left and discredit them in that way because it's so obviously stupid. But then a lot of the good things that we want to do as progressives to fix what's broken gets left out because of these ridiculous ideas.
That's right. That's right. And to me, it's like, we're talking about the idea that we're getting into these increasingly subtle discernments culturally, of which DEI does see a lot of them, right? It does see the idea of there's truth to a microaggression. It's important not to conflate a microaggression with a concrete aggression or oppression, because they're really different. But the fact they can see them is really important. Likewise, do trans women, should they have a right to compete? I mean, of course, right? It's like, it's patently unfair and cruel to say that because you've decided to change your gender identification at 17 or 18 or 19, you have to sit on the sidelines for the rest of your life. That also doesn't feel very fair or very kind or very equitable. Yeah. But we can't make one group feel better about themselves and give them a chance to compete at the expense of another group, right? That perpetuates the whole thing that we're trying to solve here. Right? It creates the hypocrisy of, tough crap, ladies. You're just going to have to get your asses kicked by these trans women who are going to dominate your sports. It's an ugly and bad solution. But we do need a solution that can be fair and kind. And I don't know what that is, whether that's creating a third league or a third. I'm not sure, but it will need to be something that will need to be addressed, as compassionately and fairly and equitably as we can manage.
Yeah, I mean, if you've gone through physical changes as a trans person, a woman becoming a man, that have given you the strength, muscularity, and all, to a man, then you compete in women's sports. It's like, that's not fair either. That's
exactly. That's my whole point. Right. Exactly.
It just doesn't work.
Exactly. And that's why there's not a lot of clamoring the other way too, right? There aren't a lot of trans men that are clamoring to, fight in elite MMA circles, because they'd be like, yeah, sure, come in, fight all you want, right? Because it wouldn't go well for them. There's no resistance on the other side because there is a biological primacy and determinacy that's not reducible to culture that is at play here. That's why it only exists with trans women, and we don't hear any of these arguments with trans men, because it isn't a factor because of biological determinacy. Yeah. Simple.
And you've looked at the implications of power and oppression in a number of other areas. Would you like to talk about some of those?
Yes, thank you, Roger, for getting me back on topic. So we covered the idea of sports here a little bit, and I'll just cover one more topic, and it has two parts to it. But so, boy, every year we hear about the wage gap between men and women, and it's a perennial issue. And we are told that women make 83 cents to the dollar for what a man makes, which is true, but there's an asterisk by that. And so we're told, okay, 83 cents to a dollar. Why? Why has this happened? Well, because of oppression and power, right? Because evil men are creating boys' clubs and excluding women from positions of power and access. And that's how you explain this 83 cents to a dollar. It's the only explanation. period. And we have to address this system-wide. Well, here's the problem. The problem is that is the uncontrolled wage gap. The uncontrolled wage gap is when we take all men who are working and all women who are working, and we look at how much money they make, and then we average it out, and then we have a 17-cent gap between them, which is alarming. Yet, apropos to this whole conversation, if it's caused by oppression and power, then we would need and want to address that, because we wouldn't want women that we love, our sisters, mothers, and spouses, to be treated unfairly, right? But of course, I would feel compelled to do something about this. But here's the problem. When we look at the controlled wage gap, the controlled wage gap is when you control for factors. So you make sure that the people you're comparing have the same education level, the same position title, the same work experience, work the same amount of hours a week. And when you control for these things, so you're comparing apples to apples, the wage gap disappears. The wage gap is 99 cents for women to $1 for men, which is statistically irrelevant. So there is no wage gap. It doesn't exist when you control for factors that I just listed. It only exists when we take all women and all men. So the question becomes, why? Well, there's a number of reasons that could explain it, which is what the president of Harvard was saying about the STEM fields, right? It could be because women choose pregnancy and motherhood, and they go out of the workforce. And when they go out of the workforce, their income goes down to zero, which is going to make a difference if you're looking at all men and all women. It could be because women tend to choose less insane hours, right? What it takes to get into the corner law office, what it takes to be the CEO, you have to be a evolutionary outlier to do those things. These are men, and they're almost all men, that'll work 100 hours a week, that'll work 110 hours a week. You put these guys in a forest by themselves, and all they'll do is cut trees down all day long. They cannot abide being still. And most men can't compete with them, to say much less most women. It could be because women choose professions that pay less and are more safe. So there are about 5,000 workplace deaths a year in America where people get killed on the job. 90% of the deaths are to men. So what does that mean? Well, it's because men tend to choose the more dangerous and higher paying jobs where they put their lives on the line. Women tend to choose safer jobs. And that impacts this 83 cents to $1. So all of that is said just to say that this 83 cents to $1 run through critical race theory, a presumption of oppression and a power, it's just as ridiculous and absurd as saying that the reason the Kenyans win most marathons is because of oppression and power. It just doesn't seem to be true.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't seem to be true, because if it was true, then the controlled wage gap would exist. If these oppressions were really happening, then women wouldn't be making 99 cents to $1 when we control for things. Or in the STEM fields, women make $1.01 to $1 that a man makes. They're beginning to barely out-earn men when we control for these things.
And there's very interesting information to be found in the nitty-gritty within professions too. As I understand it, the two professions with the biggest differential between men and women are financial advising and medicine. Mm-hmm. And in medicine, which is my own field, having looked into this some, it gets very interesting. And why is there such a big differential? Well, clearly, and I should say a point you have also made, Keith, that at this time there are more women in medical school than in men.
By a lot.
And things have really shifted in a relatively short time. But it's interesting the specialties they go into. Again, as in the workforce in general, the orientation is women go into relationship-oriented jobs, primary practice, pediatrics, psychiatry. Men go into the technical, toys,
Yeah.
choice things,
Or surgery.
surgery,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
surgery, radiology, etc., etc. And uh, unfairly, I think, the person-centered profession specialties are reimbursed significantly less than the technical ones, such as surgery, etc. The women also tend to work less, as it's hard to get good figures, but it looks like in their 40s, men work an average of low 50 hours a week. Female physicians work high 30 hours a week.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
It's a big difference.
And so that's the whole idea. If you control for that factor, then their incomes will actually become equal.
Yeah.
Which is
Now
interesting.
it gets a little more interesting here because it turns out the women spend more time with each patient than the male physicians do.
Mhm.
And it looks like there's a slightly better outcome that women physicians have with their patients, which fits. You're spending more time if you're more relationally oriented, etc. Well, that's pretty interesting. And I personally, I have a female GP, and I'm just overwhelmed with the generosity with which she gives her time. So there are a lot of interesting factors here in terms of the differences in terms of male-female income, and as you're pointing to.
And that's where men or male physicians can really learn from women. Okay. And I've known doctors in private practice who have taken on these feminine strengths, such as spending time, caring, great bedside manner. And you can't get an appointment with them. People just love them. They're so desired in the field. So pay attention, men.
Well, I think you've
Kate.
both touched on something that's also really important. Again, with this idea of not straw manning anything, is it possible, is it probable that in the STEM fields, if 4 out of 5 people are men, that a boys' culture, that a subtle misogyny might develop? You're goddamn right that might happen. Might it create an environment that is a little hostile towards women? Absolutely. So I want to be really careful here and say that, like, I don't want to dismiss that misogyny and a toxic workplace culture can't form, right? I think these things can come, even if what's causing it isn't actually necessarily oppression and overt sexism. So this is a nuanced and complicated thing, because I would never want to dismiss someone that said, hey, I tried to go into STEM, or I tried to go into surgery, but Jesus Christ, the surgeons, it's all men, and they're all, it's all a contest of who can work the longest. I couldn't exist in there, and there was no openness or tolerance of the softer, more feminine, blah, blah, blah. So, I think these things we're talking about, again, these are all multipolar phenomena. They're very complex. If anything, it's just, again, back to this humility and trying to look at things as open-mindedly as we can.
Thank you for bringing in the multiple factors again, Keith, because I think that's absolutely crucial that we keep that in mind. Yeah. Did you have anything more on the power and oppression?
One more piece, just to drive it home. It sort of adds, I think, a final nail in the coffin here for me. But the idea that men out women because of oppression. So Uber did a big study a few years back. Actually, I think it was The Economist that did a study on Uber, and they found that there was a 7% pay gap in favor of men. Now, they had already had a whole bunch of people go through and ensure that there was no subtle sexism in the way that the algorithm picked things out. So the algorithm basically didn't know the gender of the people that were driving, so it couldn't make sexist choices. And yet there's a 7% pay gap. Well, again, if we go back to our classic DEI 101, well, what causes it? Well, it's got to be oppression and power. That's why. But what the authors found was really interesting, that there were 3 things that led men to making more money than women. And one was that men had been driving longer on the platform on average. So most men drove longer than most women, which meant they got better assignments. The second one was that Men were more willing to work later hours and in worse traffic than women were, which made them, if you go out Friday night at 11 o'clock in the club area in New York, right, you're going to make a lot of money. And the third thing was that men drove something like 4% faster than women on average. And you take these three things together and you add them up and you run it over a couple years and a couple 100,000 drivers, and you find that men out-earn women, not because of any oppressive power structure or patriarchy, but because of these subtle sex differences in the way men and women behave. So I would just add that as another place where the evidence shows that these stories of oppression and power have to be held carefully and lightly.
And Keith, I'd like to add in and have you comment on one more factor that may play a role in different wages for men and women. And this is a really tricky issue, and I hope that people will hear it as simply presenting some facts. But IQ, you mentioned that, there's an emphasis on race and gender as the main factors that need to be considered in diversity, equity, inclusion. But you mentioned there are lots of other sources of privilege, and one of them is IQ. And IQ correlates with income.
Absolutely.
And opportunity and educational success and a whole slew of things.
Unless it gets too high. If it gets too high, then it begins to actually work the other way.
That's also true. Yeah.
Yeah. Like really, if your IQ is over 160, it's not good. You're so smart that you can't figure out how to make money.
Yeah. And integral, we'd say, because that line is so overexpressed, it takes away from the other things that you need to be successful. So,
yeah.
Well, and it's common knowledge that averaged out, men and women have the same average IQ.
Correct.
However, there are gender differences, and the data is very clear. Men tend to excel in spatial IQ. Women far outperform men in verbal IQ. What is almost never spoken about is the fact that there's a difference in the standard deviation or the range.
That's right.
Which is that men have a much higher variability in IQ, meaning that there are more really bright and
really
intellectually challenged.
Really dumb, yeah.
Yeah.
To call a dog a dog, yeah.
I wasn't going to use that word. But yeah, there are more men in institutions, for example, for men, low IQ. So that in itself will tend to bias towards more males excelling at the very highest levels. And I almost never see this talked about, and maybe it's just too hot a topic.
Well, I mean, you remember the huge kerfuffle that happened over the book, The Bell Curve, right? Years ago.
Of course, yeah.
And so the trouble whenever you start talking about statistics is that people almost immediately run to eugenics and, all of these sort of histrionic ideas that what you're trying to imply. Even Jordan Peterson, he's only ever said, look, the data's in, men and women, basically speaking, have the same IQ. I don't even think he's willing to touch that rail. But you're right. It's when we look at the data, the far edges of the bell curve, the people that are all the way out on the edge, they're all men. Like for the exceptionally brilliant, and the exceptionally stupid, right? It's like men have the edges really covered much more thoroughly than women do. It's just a biological curiosity. But what Peterson argues, and what some other people argue, is that the data is also really clear that when you look at the bell curve of secondary sex traits, for instance, which are obviously driven by primary sex traits, men on average are 10%, stronger, faster, larger, et cetera, than women are on average. But when you go to the edges of the bell curve, the best fighters in the world, it's all men, right? The top 50 fighters in the world in mixed martial arts, all men. There are no women in that at all. Like that bell curve is entirely made up of men. If you look at the top 50 CEOs in the world as far as how they function and work ethic and what they do, and that they're also all men. There's a weird thing that happens on the edges of the bell curve where men tend to be out there by themselves because of these sort of extraordinary secondary sex characteristics that make them outliers. And this gets into another point, which maybe we can get into next time because it's a whole complicated argument. But this is where the equality of outcomes argument that DEI can make can run into a lot of problems, right? It's like half of the most elite fighters in the world shouldn't be women. This doesn't make any sense. It probably doesn't make any sense that half of the most elite CEOs in the world should be women as well. Not if they're expected to work and compete against these biological and cultural outliers. So what I hear you saying, Roger, is that the data shows that, we have some anomalies in these decades worth of data that if we look at honestly and clearly, it creates some confounding implications that I think we're all trying to figure out what that means and what may or may not need to be done about it.
Yeah. And bottom line, it all comes at bottom. We have enormous range of individual differences.
Yeah.
There's a far wider range of individual differences than there is on average in differences between male, female. And no matter what a person's gift, everyone should have the opportunity to actualize their capacities to live their fullest and best life. Fairness demands no less. In one sense, all these differences are incredibly important and need to be acknowledged in any nuanced conversation such as you're offering us, Keith. On the other hand, no matter what the talents or lack of talents anyone has, everyone deserves to be treated as well as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the point.
Yeah, the basic human dignity is really what I think we're talking about here, that all of us deserve to be treated with the dignity that is innate in all of us.
Yeah. Keith, this feels like a good point to bring this phase of our conversation to a close. Anything you'd like to say in summation?
I would just remind everyone again and remind myself again, right, that, all these things, all these opinions, all of this stuff, I hope it's part of a living debate. And if anybody that's listening to this wants to challenge me or show me a deeper truth, I am always eager to expand what I think is true. I would say that.
Well, here I am, John Dupuy again, and I'm here to talk about supporting the Deep Transformation Podcast. The podcast has been an amazing experience for Roger and myself and for our team, and it's been growing. We're currently in the top 2% of worldwide podcasts, which is really remarkable. We think it's very important. We think deep transformation is the only way to go, because if we don't, we're in serious trouble. And we're so grateful for the amazing presences and spirit and soul and people who've been on our podcast. We'd also like to ask you again for your support, financial support, and thank you for all of you who have been supporting this. And up till now, it's all been out of pocket for Roger and myself. And it takes money to produce, to pay our staff, and for marketing. And so the circle keeps on growing, but the quicker that could happen, the more positive effect we could have in the world. And that's what we're here to do. And I was thinking before this, upstairs in my meditation room, I have the famous 10 Zen ox herding pictures up there. And the final one, after you guys go through all this journey, is going back into the marketplace with open hands and open heart. And so that's what we're trying: open hands, open heart, open mind, so that we can do what? We can transform effectively and deeply and listen to some of the greatest minds on our planet as to how to do that. So thank you for your support. We love you and you matter. God bless.
Keith, we've covered 5 of the, quotes, 7 deadly sins of DEI. And we have 2 more to go before we take an overview. But maybe this would be a good time to just, since we've been through 5, just to refresh people's memory on what they are and just give one or a couple of sentences about each.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the first one is a simplistic view of privilege. And in that, we just talked about the idea that people that advocate DEI tend to talk about race and gender and sex, but they have a really hard time acknowledging things like education level, which is a huge indicator of financial and societal success, um, class or money, and omitting those two things is really causes a real problem in the view of privilege, because often the people that are advocating for this DEI viewpoint tend to have money and they tend to be educated. So they sort of cut themselves out of the privilege loop by only focusing on race and gender and sex. And then the third and final piece that they tend to omit is whether you come from a one or two family home. And we got a little bit into the statistics around that, which are pretty shocking. The second one is Undiverse diversity. And, with this, it really just comes down to the idea that with DEI, there's too often a mindset that wants to have diversity means that people who look and think just like I do, but have different skin color or different gender orientation or different parts, different boy or girl parts, as opposed to diversity of viewpoint, a place that is full of conservatives and liberals and, moderates and, people who may not disagree with some of the tenets of DEI, and actually allowing that to be part of the diverse tapestry of opinion and things like this. So limited view of diversity. The third one is an intolerant tolerance. And, this is one of the big paradoxes of DEI, but it can become rigid and calcified. It can demand things like purity tests, which are happening in a lot of the universities, that you have to talk about what you've done to fight for equality and to overcome systemic racism and sexism and all these other isms. The presumption being that you agree with the theory, that you agree that it's caused by overt misogyny or racism or these other things, and you need to say what you're doing to fight it. And there's obviously no room to say that, hey, maybe I don't fully agree with what's being put forward here. So this idea of intolerance of other viewpoints, which gets into like a McCarthyism, and then there's the big one that we went into was this idea of an overemphasis on oppression and power. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit more detail in a little bit, but this is the idea of pushing everything through CRT or critical race theory, so that if I see disparities that exist in culture between a historically underrepresented group and a dominant group, if there's more of a dominant group represented than an underrepresented group, the presumption is that the only thing that can be causing it is oppression/power. And I gave a number of examples around income and athletics and things like the wage gap and all this other stuff, where that it's actually not true. So we always want to be open to the idea that equality of outcomes, overemphasis on oppression and power is a problem. And then I think the last one was the idea of equality of outcomes. And equality of outcomes is a problem if there isn't actual oppression going on that's being addressed. And one of the examples of that is, we look at the last 25 years of 80% of people in STEM fields being men and 20% being women, and the presumption that it's being caused by systemic sexism. And so people in DEI space say, well, this equality of opportunity isn't working. And so we have to focus on an equality of outcome. We have to make sure that half of all of the STEM people are women. And the trouble with that is that if it's not being caused by oppression and power, which we just talked about, then the idea of equality of outcomes is a real violence that's forced on culture. And it's actually quite oppressive, unfair, sexist, racist, and all these other things. So that's sort of a brief overview of how those first five tie together.
Well, that's a great summary, Keith. That sure gives us a reminder and overview. So thank you. In a nutshell, you just hit it. So let's move on to the sixth issue or problem you see with this well-intentioned but problematic movement of DEI, and that is tribalism. Tell
Yeah.
us about that.
Yeah, so I have a great quote here from a woman named Susan Neiman, and she wrote a book called Left is Not Woke in 2023. And so she has this great quote where she said, contemporary voices considered to be leftists have abandoned the philosophical ideas that are central to any left-wing standpoint, a commitment to universalism over tribalism, a firm distinction between justice and power, and a belief in the possibility of progress. All of these ideas are connected, she says, and it begins with a concern for marginalized persons, but ends by reducing each to the prism of their marginalization. And I love that, right? So what is she saying? She's saying that what can happen in DEI spaces is that, we've spent the last couple hundred years fighting for the idea of universal human rights, with this idea that we are trying to push cultural evolution to a place where we view people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. This idea of getting past gender, race, these, I talked about it before, but these concrete, obvious discernments, differences between kinds of people. And what the DEI space has seen correctly, and there's truth in this, that there can be a subtle racism or sexism that permeates the culture that can create roadblocks for people. And, we can talk about the specifics of that, but there's real truth in that. And we need to really look at those claims very carefully and honestly. But then they make this next leap where they reduce everybody to a tribalistic idea that, I'm a white cisgendered man. That's the first white, straight male. And those things are the most dominant, the most important parts about me, not the fact that I'm a human being, or that I'm an American, or that I'm a world citizen, or that I have a universal right to being treated with dignity, regardless of what I look like or how I identify. And so this tribalistic emphasis on race and sex, on the concrete things, has created some of these sort of silly paradoxes, which gets back into the first point I talked about, which is an oversimplistic view of privilege. Which means, if I'm sitting in a room and I look and there's 5 white people and a black man, and I say, well, that poor black man has been oppressed and he's suffered from systemic racism and he's had a much harder time at life than I've had. We need to make sure that we accommodate him because of all he's had to endure. And I do all that without ever actually opening my mouth and having a conversation with the person, right? Mm-hmm. That's tribalism. I mean, that's just stupid. It's naive. It's destructive, And as I talked about earlier in the talk, that man may have a PhD from Harvard. He may have had a 2-family home. He could be a multimillionaire and an entrepreneur. He might not need to be treated as if he's struggled more than someone else. The presumption itself is racist and demeaning from a certain level, right? So the idea of stripping people down to just their tribalistic identity is very, very destructive. And, one of the critiques that's come up from DEI is that me saying that means that I'm hopelessly naive, right? That this idea of wanting to live in a colorblind society, that's considered proof that I am so hopelessly inside of a white supremacist system that what I'm saying, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, and what a DEI advocate would say is my white privilege has allowed me the luxury of living in a world where I'm not impacted by race. And so I can take that position out of ignorance. And there's some truth in that. There's some validity in the critique, right? And that a person of color doesn't have the luxury of living in a colorblind world because they're on the receiving end of racism all the time. So that's there's something in the critique that's worth noting. But to then say, to accuse me of being racist by even advocating that we might someday want to live in a colorblind society, that that's an honorable, liberal, humanistic goal. That smacks me as being very tribalistic. No, we can never evolve past our race and our gender and our sex.
And it's also very, very racist, I
It
might add.
is. Yeah, yeah, it is, of course, right. So, and then what this ends up doing, so this tribalistic emphasis that presumes that we are the smallest of our parts first and foremost, rather than the largest of our parts first and foremost. It creates this like sort of crazy funhouse mirror where, you know, the Americans in the audience will know what I'm talking about, but for the Europeans and others, there is a group in the United States called the Proud Boys, which sort of came up as Donald Trump came to power in 2016. And it was a sort of, you know, quote unquote alt-right group that was advocating, you know, sort of pushing back against a lot of the liberal democratic norms and whatnot. But the liberal press, they really didn't know what to do once it was pointed out that the leader of the Proud Boys was a Cuban black guy, so he wasn't white at all, and that 1/3 of the membership was non-Caucasian.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had this problem because they're labeling this group as a white supremacist group because in their tribalistic toolbox, that's what they need to do. So it's a white group, it's a white racist, white supremacist group run by people that aren't white. So how do they explain it? Well, they came up with this hilarious idea. It was a big piece, I think, in the New York Times, but the idea of multiracial whiteness. And I love this because this just explains how DEI can completely go off the rails, right? So multiracial whiteness is the idea that these groups, they're so enamored with white supremacy and what we've been able to pull off as white people culturally that they unconsciously aspire to be part of the white ruling class. And so they've internalized white supremacy inside of themselves. And that creates this idea of multiracial whiteness where they are unconsciously fighting to basically overthrow a power structure that they actually want to be a part of. So it's this like convoluted Freudian sort of argument. And then I've seen people on the left do that also when women critique some of the DEI space, they say they have internalized patriarchy. I mean, talk about condescending, right? Or that Black people have, you know, if they disagree with DEI stuff, they have internalized racism. Or if a white person critiques DEI, they have white fragility. And so there's all these ways that the tribalistic mindset continues to manifest and reinforce itself. So I'll stop a lot.
Yeah, and I might add that, you know, while there's a kernel of truth, I mean, you know, I think everybody here, I can safely say, we're really against racism.
Of course.
And that's true, but it comes skillful means when the cure sometimes becomes worse than the disease or feeds the disease, then we have to say, whoa, you know, what really needs to be done to rectify this? And is there anything we do with our magic wand to make it go away? But no, how can we take concrete steps that begins to change things over time? And I'm reading an exhaustive biography of Abraham Lincoln right now. And I'm about up to the second, the re-election. And it just has all the quotes from everybody that hated him or loved him. And it just really, really goes on and on and on. But you can see that while there's some similarities, and like politics are nasty, they were nasty back then too.
Sure were.
You can say that we've really made an amazing amount of progress in some areas over the last 30 years, 40 years, whatever it's been since 1865 when the war ended and Lincoln was assassinated. So, yeah, what is skillful means a solution? How do we not throw fire and divide and point fingers at and make people push them further into their corners?
Yeah.
But how do we begin to lift it and fulfill the dreams of this guy up here, you know? And so what do we do with that? And when something gets in the way, it's hurtful and it's not wise, and it's not a good thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
Uh,
Go ahead, Roger. Yeah.
no, go, please.
Um, yeah, I think I'll just close down that point and just say, I mean, John, I think you touched on it, but for me, when I talk to someone who's well-meaning, right, in this space, I try to gently point out that, like, hey, some of these ideas of universal humanness and universal compassion and universal dignity, regardless, do you agree that they're important? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, great. I mean, so we're in agreement there. And, you know, and I try to just point out that it's always a good idea, to say the least, but I try to point this out really sincerely, that it's a really good idea not to presume and project onto someone based on the color of their skin or their gender or their sex what their life experience might have been like, because we don't know. And so to be curious. And while you can run the statistics that they may likely have had a harder time of things than another group of people, that's taking the aggregate of all people in that group. And we always want to be careful not to presume someone else's experience. And when I explain it that way, people, we're in agreement.
Yeah, that's nice, Keith. Looking for common ground as a way of undermining the assumption of differences and inherent conflict. Beautiful. Yeah. And one thing that I came late to the late to the table in realizing is I had a wise kind of friend / mentor woman who told me something that was counter to my personality and my academic background. My academic background was you go into an argument or debate to win. And she said, no, what's most important is to above the content and the argument is to nourish the relationship. And it's like, oh, that just shifted an awful lot for me, that my primary goal should be to cultivate the relationship and good feeling between two people, as opposed to winning over them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's too often we get into a mode where we're not at all interested in listening, but we're just interested in proving how right we are.
Yeah. Well, Keith, maybe this is time to move into your final quotes deadly sin, which is a really important one, anti-liberalism. And for me, your discussion of this and some reading I've been doing made me realize that liberalism is a term which, my goodness, we've all been exposed to probably with mother's milk, including me. But I really didn't truly know what it was. So maybe you could start with giving us an outline of what liberalism is, and then we can move into the anti-liberalism.
Sure. Well, boy, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could take that word, but I would say, without getting into the philosophy behind it, which would move us into an hour-long cul-de-sac, in a nutshell, I feel like liberals and progressives, the idea is that you feel like the world needs to be changed to be more compassionate and kind and open in some way. And if you're a conservative, your orientation is to maintaining the status quo of what is, because the traditions have power and beauty and a necessity for providing stability and continuity of certain cultural norms.
And Keith, isn't there something else here with liberalism? And that the term is used in two ways. One is the way you've described it, as the kind of a political stance, as kind of the polarity for conservatism. But it's also used in a broader sense as kind of the underlying ethos of Western civilization of the last couple of hundred years, of beliefs in, for example, some of the things you've been talking about: universal human rights, legal equality,
Yeah.
opportunity, belief in some degree of objectivity of evidence, and truth as a real central value, separation of church and state, freedom of religion, respect for evidence and reason. So that's part of my confusion, is the word is used in two quite different, or not entirely different, but significantly different ways. One is a political stance, and the other is a more general perspective on culture and values and politics.
Yes, and they're obviously tied to each other. So, I think the philosophical ideas of liberalism, those principles, that evolution has clearly won the day from any historical perspective. This is where some of the people advocate that progress is an illusion. But, if we take even a small step back, we can see how inaccurate that statement is. We go from the founding fathers in America to where all men are created equal, and then, which meant basically meant white men. And then there's an evolution where it includes Black men and former slaves. And then there's an evolution where it includes women. And then there's an evolution where it deals with all of the sort of nasty underbelly of actually more authentically trying to free people of color in the 1950s and 60s. And then there's a movement, towards further trying to free women. And then there's a further movement to bring liberalistic values to gay, lesbian, and bisexuals. And then there's a further liberal movement to bring those same values to transgender people. And so the march of these liberal values of respect and tolerance and a presumption of human dignity and access to all of the norms, cultural norms, and jobs and opportunities and rights of marriage, and et cetera, that march has really been uninterrupted for the last 200 years. It just simply moves forward, regardless of how you feel about it.
Yeah, and so what exactly has been the nature of the anti-liberalism of the DEI movement?
Yeah, and this is where a lot of people I know and have been close to, which I would call more traditional liberals, 90s liberals, if you will, what the ACLU used to stand for, the American Civil Liberties Union here in the States. The idea of, a right to always speak your mind no matter what it is you say. I will always defend your right to free speech, even if the speech is hateful or destructive or racist or sexist. That ideal is a principle upon which any free society must stand. That is a hallmark of liberalism. The ACLU very famously went to court to advocate that a Holocaust denier could deny the Holocaust. That's something the ACLU would never do today, ever. Part of the anti-liberalism has come from this collapse around believing that people's feelings and their sense of marginalization and protecting those things are more important than free speech. So we have, safe zones on campuses, which is, to any traditional liberal that was raised in a rigorous academic environment, having a safe space on a university, a safe space from ideas. Obviously there should be a safe space from physical violence, but that's a given. But a safe space from ideas that I might find threatening. I can't think of anything less liberal.
What does that exactly mean for those of us who haven't been in academia for a while? A safe space, safe from what?
Safe from ideas that might be threatening to me. So, a safe space, there are lots of examples around people who were supporting Trump in 2016 who that was considered to be an act of violence. Because Trump is a misogynist and a sexist, and therefore anyone who advocates for him makes me feel personally unsafe, which means therefore there can be no open politics around supporting Trump. That itself is an act of hate. That's so anti-liberal, it's almost inconceivable, right? It's also very childish. The idea that young adults can't be the stewards of their own minds and their own emotions, it's also very insulting. But I don't want to go on too many tangents here. The anti-liberal idea, it's really just quite simple, which is that, we have to be able to speak what we think is the truth, even if we end up offending people, because that's how we discover and debate ideas. And it's anti-liberal to say that I don't want to let a speaker who denies the Holocaust speak. It's a horrible thing to deny the Holocaust, right? It's terrible. But if I deny them access to speak, it means I consider their ideas and their words dangerous. And if I consider their words and their ideas dangerous, that means that I'm justified in banning and outlawing them, because I'm conflating the idea of verbal ideas with physical violence. And that is as anti-liberal as you can get. The idea that someone is advocating a point of view that I disagree with, and that I need to shut that speaker down so they can't speak because the ideas themselves are so dangerous that they can't be heard. Well, that's ridiculous. In any traditional liberal view, it's you bring your ideas and I bring my ideas, and I will defeat your ideas in debate, and I will defeat your ideas by having better ideas. And in so doing, because we're in the realm of words, we don't actually have to get to physical violence. But if I deny someone the right to speak at all, then the only avenue they have left to express themselves is physical violence. So that's part of what we're seeing with the rise of some of these alt-right groups. They're being denied a platform to speak. Well, what recourse do they have left? Right. So this terror that the left has developed over this idea that ideas can be dangerous. Ideas can't be dangerous. People can be dangerous, but ideas can be stupid or profound or well-researched or poorly researched or based in misogyny and racism or not based in misogyny and racism, right? But they're not dangerous. The ideas aren't dangerous. Anyway, so that's one of the ways. A couple other really big anti-liberal ideas that DEI has advocated that I find especially offensive. The whole idea of white fragility is absurdist. Now, again, I can acknowledge and say that, are there some people out there that if their view of a liberal utopia where everyone is treated equal is challenged, they're going to have a irrational reaction and blah, blah, blah. Of course, there's some truth to it. But the idea, like if I'm offering all of these very well thought out ideas that I've been offering over the last few hours around DEI, and if someone says, well, that's just Keith being, just his white fragility, it's an utter dismissal of the ideas on their own terms, and it's a refusal to argue with me in good faith. I think I mentioned this before, but it's akin to when Sigmund Freud, reduced everything or almost everything to sex. And when other psychologists would disagree with him, he would say, well, you don't understand my theory because you have repressed sexuality, So just a total refusal to engage in actually the content of their argument. White fragility is the exact same thing. It's a non-argument. It's an inauthentic dodge, and it's anti-liberal. The idea, another one of the really dangerous ideas, is this idea that silence is violence, right? Silence is violence. So, well, okay, but that doesn't sound so bad. We should speak up if we see oppression. What's the problem, Keith? Well, the problem is, that gets into some of this idea of compelled speech. And that if I don't speak the way you think I should speak, my not speaking itself is violence, not wrong, not immoral, not unjust, not selfish, but violence. Silence is violence. And so that's setting a stage where we have an expectation back to this idea of tribalism, where impurity test and all these other things, where it's like, if I'm not anti-racist, if I'm not fighting for this thing actively, then I'm not only part of the problem, I'm part of the violence that's being perpetuated on minorities and people of color and women. Right? It's a very dangerous idea. And The other anti-liberalism are things we've talked about, allowing trial by public opinion. I told you guys earlier, if I work for Google or Meta, or if I worked for the Boulder High School, I was on the school board here in Boulder, Colorado, I would almost certainly be fired from my job for having this conversation. I'm hard to imagine anything more anti-liberal than that. I'm not over here, goose stepping and advocating for some sort of racial this or that. Just trying to have a really open-ended, honest conversation about these things. But that wouldn't be tolerated by a lot of places, certainly not by Google, right? Not by their culture. Or by X before Elon Musk bought it and turned it upside down. So anyway, that's just some of the highlights of the way that this movement has become anti-liberal. And if it's going to proceed, it has to see and really shake out those places, because those places where it's anti-liberal are at odds with those of us like me that would otherwise be on board with some of what these DEI claims are actually saying.
Yeah, and again, one of the common recurrent themes here is the ideals are great, and there's just been this intellectual, conceptual, I don't know, distortion in the service of what have been taken to be values that triumph over all other values and deny other perspectives. And as John was saying in an earlier conversation, one of the challenges here seems like the DEI movement allows only one perspective and value, their own. And as you said, this is an example of a phenomenon which I think deserves its own name, and I wish we could come up with a good name for it. But it's basically when one holds a belief system and interprets the failure to agree with that belief system as proof that a person is, defective in some way, which the belief system lays out. That's just a very dangerous thing, and we see it here. We see it as in many, many cases, as you said, with Freudianism, but many examples we could give. So yeah. Anything else on anti-liberalism, or is it time for us? We've covered all 7 of the issues that concerns you have about DEI. Is it time to step back and take a look and integrate here?
Well,
there's one more point that I would like to make.
Yeah,
please
go ahead,
John. We talked at the exact same time. I didn't hear you.
Well, you can. Okay, I'll go.
Okay, so so I'll go. So one final point that I would like to say, where we can look at the sort of we can steel man the DEI point of view. So there was a thing in the 1970s where the orchestras in America, they noted there was a problem in that almost everyone that was playing for them were white men. And so I believe it was in New York City, they came up with this really brilliant novel solution, which was to do blind auditions for symphonies, where the person practicing or auditioning would be behind a screen. So you couldn't see anything about them, gender or race. And it's brilliant because it dealt with the unconscious bias that people have. And so after they started doing that, the representation of women went up from like 4% or 5% to 50%, like that. And the percent of Asians went up from something like 4% to something like 60%, or something crazy, right? Considering the amount of percentage of the population they are versus how overrepresented they became in the symphony. And this is considered a real win for liberal principles. Okay, what we're going to do, it's going to be a true meritocracy. We're going to let people come in based on how qualified they are and not what they look like. Okay, it's great. So what's the DEI critique? So the DEI critique, they look at this idea of equality of outcomes, and they say, well, there's 1% of people in the symphony who are Black, and there's, say, 13% of the population, or 15%, depending on where you're living, that are Black. So this policy of blind auditions hasn't worked because they're still massively underrepresented. And what they would say part of the problem might be that people of color come to the symphony and they don't see anyone who looks like them. And so they don't teach these things. They're not interested in these things. And the perpetuation of them not being in this part of culture continues. But if we force an equality of outcome, where say 20% of people who join the symphony have to be Black, what that might do is that might then allow when people come to the symphony and they are people of color to see people who look like them, and that might inspire young children, and we might actually break the cycle that's happening. So the argument is it's not a terrible argument, and it's motivated by the right thing. And the only place that I would really want to get into a lively debate with someone who advocated it is that in two places. One, you would have to admit that in so doing, you would be denying qualified people a position in the symphony. So you just have to own that. Look, it means that we're not going to hire 20 people who are qualified because of their skin color. That's what we're going to do. We're going to admit it. We're going to tell the truth. And we're doing it because we have a greater goal in mind. The second thing that I would want to debate them would be in the idea that at what point do you determine that you've done enough and that you stop insisting on equality of outcomes? When do we say we've won? Because what I see with so many of these things, whether it's CEOs, female CEOs, or women in tech, or people of color in the symphony, it's that how we win, how we know when we have quote unquote fixed marginalization isn't defined. And I will never join a fight where the victory is never defined. It's like the war on drugs, for in America here in the 80s, right? It's like, why couldn't we win the war on drugs? Well, because what victory meant was never defined. So how could you ever possibly win? And far too often DEI stuff sets up a boogeyman, and they wage war against, racism or sexism, but they never tell us what winning would look like and when we could actually lay down our metaphorical weapons and celebrate.
Thank you.
Okay, Keith, that's a great distillation of the concerns about the anti-liberalism and DEI.
Okay, can I add something, Roger, before we move
Please,
on?
yeah.
Yeah, one of the ironies of this whole thing is that when you go far to the left or far to the right, you begin to mirror each other. And
Right.
the things we criticize about the far right are the things that come out with the far left. And you look at Hitler and Stalin, who, they had their affair early on, but they eventually hated each other, these two systems that accounted for millions and millions of people dying. And their tactics were very, very similar. They had white racism, Mein Kampf, as opposed to Marxist-Leninist Stalinism, and but they did secret police in the night, the assassination or the mass killing of those people who disagreed with you, got in the way, the dogmatic, there's only one way to see things, and this and that, and it just becomes a problem. And I don't know if people can kind of realize that, because what we should be asking is, what is the problem and what is the solution? And if our solutions aren't helping these issues, inequality, racism, poverty, all these things, how do we find the way through? And what Steve McIntosh, and you're probably aware of him, is a friend and a man I respect his work, philosopher. He says, between these two extremes, we're not looking for the middle ground, but we're looking for a higher ground, so that we can kind of, okay. And I know that respect, asking open-ended questions and deeply listening can be very powerful. And I have a friend who's been on this show, Shakar Erez. He's a Israeli American, actually, but he's raising his children in Israel. And he has started a podcast. He's a brilliant therapist, where he had a Palestinian woman and a far-right Israeli woman come together and talk. And he had them at the end really expressing, talking to each other and listening and starting to like each other. And he cut it off after an hour. And I said, Shakar, you need to just keep these things going and let it flow, and you can divide it into 1, 2, or 3 parts, like we do here. I said, yes, but what a noble and a brilliant thing in a part of the world that is so inflammatory, and we're right there with them. So how do we not just find a middle between these two extremes, but find an integrated sum of the parts that is more, and it brings us to a higher place. And how do we, what do we do? How do we fix this?
Yeah, it makes me think of, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but there's a black guy here in the States that has done something like turned, a couple hundred Klansmen, convinced them to turn in their robes. And he's done it by being compassionate and kind and listening and simply meeting them with his humanity rather than shaming them or telling them how awful they are, or whatever it might be, right? But it's just what you said, John. It's person by person, and it's heart to heart, and it's him presuming the good in the person he's talking to, which is not easy, I would imagine, for a black man to talk to a active Ku Klux Klan member and to look for the good that's actually there inside of them.
I think Daryl Davis, was that who it was?
Daryl Davis, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and amazingly, he has had a number of Ku Klux Klan people give up their robes after dialoguing with them, which is pretty amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah. So that kind of dialogue is possible, and thank you for bringing this up, John, and your example, Keith, because that's really, it's a beautiful example of what we're looking for here. This a higher ground, a way through. Unfortunately, certain ideologies, when they become fervent belief systems, tend to polarize and create reactivity and the reverse of what's intended. And that's some of what we have here with DEI, which, again, so well intended, but has become a political flashpoint and the source of political legislation trying to ban it, etc., and remove funding from universities for it and so forth. So as we step back here, it seems to me that there are two kind of errors in DEI and in what you've been talking about, Keith. One is conceptual, just it's that the way of some of the thinking here just has become distorted and thinking has become, I forget the term, there's a motivated thinking. That is where thinking is when one's motivated rationality, when one's logic is determined by what one wants to get to rather than by facts. So there are conceptual problems here, but there are also practical problems, and as you pointed to, that these ideas are being promoted with fervent righteousness and in some cases vindictiveness and divisiveness, etc. So both practical and conceptual problems here, but that's just what I see as a couple of big principles. As you step back and look at DEI and what it aims for and where it's been mistaken, and what could be done, as John was pointing to fulfill the values of DEI, to make it a truly effective, beautiful, harmonious, correcting social movement that it aspires to be.
Yeah. So this is a potentially a big question. So on the one hand, there's small things like historically, the last 2 generations, it was the political right that would do things like want to ban books or ban ideas, ban the teaching of evolution, right? Or ban books that they found objectionable, that didn't have Christian ideals or that introduced, homosexual themes or whatever. But then what's happened with the DEI space is now the DEI space, they're all too eager to ban ideas, which I just talked about. And so when the left doesn't have a moral high ground to step up to talk about deeper, better, more inclusive principles, then the whole thing just starts to get dragged into a place where everyone's trying to ban everything. And that's a really unfortunate place that we're seeing ourselves. So one of the things that's happened, one of the things that I think that's led to the vitriol and the self-righteousness that you mentioned, Roger, is that if we take DEI, so this idea from an integral space, if we look at the mindset, the postmodern mindset that's allowed these subtleties to come forth, and if we look at DEI from a purely supportive place, what we can see is that the evolution of consciousness that happened in the 20th century, where a majority of people went from being able to see rational truth to seeing post-rational truths. Well, that means a whole bunch of things developmentally, but the most important and salient parts for this conversation is that what that means is that people can do a couple of really important things. They can go from a rational point of view, you can see concrete racism, which means I can see redlining. I can see that schools don't allow Black people in. I can see that women aren't allowed to vote. I can see that women aren't allowed to open a bank account without their husband's signature. I can see these really concrete forms of racism, and social justice from a rational point of view is going to address these sort of overt concrete things that everybody can see.
The Civil Rights Law of 1964 was a really good example.
Perfect example. Right, right. Brown versus Board of Education, all this kind of stuff, right? Separate but equal, the overturning of this idea, but separate but equal, based in rational foundations of thought and perspective. And the other thing that the rational point of view, the orange point of view, the modern point of view can do really well at its best is it can see cognitive bias. And we know this because, a bedrock of scientific research, as you know, Roger, is, double and triple blind studies, because it's known that I, as the researcher, am unable to get my cognitive bias out of the way, and that will pollute my research. And so I have to make sure that the tests are done in a way that isolates my bias from the test that I'm trying to do. Okay. So what happens then as this postmodern view comes online? Well, the postmodern view emerges out of, transcends what includes the modern point of view. And so it can do those things that modernism can do at its best, but the postmodern view at its best has a couple of additional capacities. One of them is that it can see that this idea of cognitive bias that I might have as a researcher, that cognitive bias I can now see is operating on a much subtler level in culture. So another way to say it is that rather than these overt concrete racisms, my bias against maybe the subtle bias of me assuming that a tall Black kid is a basketball player, which seems relatively innocuous, right? Unless you take that bias, you project it into this subtle field of culture, you multiply it by a few million people, and then the argument goes, well, that might be creating a sort of subtle racism that's permeating the cultural field that is limiting the opportunities that this young, tall Black man, not only the opportunities that he's given, because there's a subtle unconscious presumption of athleticism, but also he might actually internalize some of these things. And so there might be a double bind going on in culture where this sort of soft racism, if you will, might really be limiting the potential growth of people who are historically marginalized. Does that all make sense? Did I get through that?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, so DEI there, or excuse me, so the postmodern viewpoint, therefore, rather than seeing just concrete racism, it's able to see this more subtle racism that can permeate culture at its best, when the postmodern view is at its best. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence for this. And I think a lot of us over the last generation have really grown up our ideas about women in sports, women as scientists, women as astronauts, people of color as, notable philosophers, and all these things that have really happened and come into the culture. I think there has been, from the postmodern point of view, a challenge to dominant, subtle cultural norms, and they have pushed into it in a way that I think has actually been quite successful. sort of challenging these soft, subtle racist ideas. So that's DEI in a nutshell at its best. And so where does it struggle? Well, the modern point of view, the sort of OG social justice, if you will, the Civil Rights Act and that sort of stuff, suffrage, rationalists, they can see cognitive bias, but they can't see projection. They can't really see when they're projected on, and they can't really see when they're projecting something about someone into the field, which is why groups of scientists can inadvertently create kind of really sexist environments, even though they don't believe that rationally, because it's sort of an unconscious projection. The postmodern point of view is going to catch it's going to catch the subtle cultural projection, as I just went through. But what the postmodern point of view can't do is it can't really see when it's projecting personally. It can see when it's projected upon. So I can look out and say, like, hey, you know what? This group, I'm a woman, and this group of scientists is projecting onto me that I'm less capable because I have a vagina. And that's effing bullshit. And I'm going to challenge that. They can see the projection. But they can't see as clearly when they're projecting their beliefs onto the world. And what this creates then is a problem built into the postmodern point of view, which is built into DEI, which we've just spent quite a bit of time talking about. But because it has a hard time seeing its projection, it opens it up to projecting all kinds of things from an individual onto the culture that may or may not be true. And the biggest place that happens that I see is critical race theory, which we can get into. But let me pause there. It's a lot of talking.
Well, well, you've just downloaded a lot, and a very good lot, and you've introduced a different dimension into our thinking about DEI and critical theory and critical race theory, which we've kind of begun to segue into, and that is that some of the developments and evolution, cultural evolution, and the advance of rights and the increasing sensitivity to disadvantage and various isms is a reflection of a psychological maturation in individuals and the culture as a whole. And that's a whole nother dimension, a very important one. So thank you for bringing that in. And it really points to, once again, a recurrent theme, the one of the really important aspects of individual development, cultural development, and even our survival as a species is really going to be dependent on our maturation through various conventional and post-conventional stages that research developmentalists have begun to map out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would also say that getting back to integral is that I think it was Einstein said you can't solve a problem on the level it was created.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to, and it's very unlikely that you're going to get far left and people from the MAGA worldview together and starting to work this stuff out. So the need for a level of development where you can intellectually look at these things and okay, this is good, what they're saying, this is bad, and start putting it together, but also more than just mere intellectuality. It has to be a heartfelt evolution where you can really look at people and see they are God too. They are, sure, they have a soul and work through it that way. And otherwise, and it seems to be so easy to get power by feeding fuel to the flame. Mm-hmm. That our divisions and our contraries and I'm really surprised. I was surprised when progressivism turned into such an angry, hateful thing. Because my first experiment, I was a wilderness guide. We had lots of green people, and they were pretty kind, gentle people. And they, we get pissed off sometimes, but there was generally trying to like early Christianity or something, bringing that love and respect for everybody, because we had a bunch of angry young people we were working with, and just to shout at them and tell them they're wrong didn't do a hell of a lot. And there's
Surprise, surprise.
yeah, surprise, surprise. But there's a I was thinking about you being a martial artist or a martial arts master, is that there's a time to stand,
Mhm.
right? This is what I believe. You know, I believe that all people should be or should be respected equally, no matter who they are, whatever subdivisions there are. And there's a time to be soft and listen, open-ended questions. So it's not just all this way or that way, but it's a combination of the soft skills, the compassion and the holding, and cutting through the bullshit and being strong and be willing to make a stand at the same time.
Mhm.
So that takes us to Roger's book he's been working on, wisdom. You know, how do you actually accomplish that
Mhm.
and do the way that the logos begins to come through, and we begin to find hope where there was nothing but conflict and darkness.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, and I mean, we have to be exemplars of this, right? That's the main thing. Like I'm going to great pains to try to talk about what's good and accurate in DEI. Um, because if I don't do that, then all I am is trying to tear it down, which is part of the whole problem. Is, in the culture today, too many people are trying to just tear things down. Um, you know, I love and admire and was very influenced by the sort of the rise of Jordan Peterson, in
Mm-hmm.
2016, 2017,
Me
2018,
too.
and thought he was very brave to stand up to the things he did, and he made great rational discernments around things like compelled speech in Canada, which was the bill around having to use pronouns or being threatened with whatever it was, fines or jail or something, which, he made a very eloquent argument around why that could be a slippery slope. But in my view, the only trouble with Jordan Peterson that I see is that he has a very hard time steel manning some of these subtleties of the postmodern point of view. For instance, the idea that, um, when the postmodern view sees and tries to point out the reality of microaggressions, that's too often dismissed as sort of people being whiny and hyperreactive and that sort of thing. And I don't think people like him can see that what that actually shows is there is a evolutionary capacity to see more and more subtle objects in culture. And so microaggressions they're a real thing. I mean, I could give a dozen examples of ways that they exist. Now, the trouble is then people in that postmodern space or the DEI space they'll then conflate a microaggression with a macroaggression. So that basically saying me asking the tall black kid if he plays basketball is the same as the Ku Klux Klan marching down the street and putting a burning crucifix on his lawn. And they will literally conflate the two and then use that as an argument to say progress is a myth, which gets into absurdity. So the only thing I'm sort of pointing to sometimes is that people like Peterson and some of the people that are critiquing these ideas of DEI, I would just love it if they could open up, if it was possible, a little more to what's being seen from these spaces where there is an actual reflection of a subtle truth that's happening culturally, so that we can be less trying to prove each other wrong.
Yeah,
I think, sorry, go ahead, John.
I was going to say I was a big Jordan Peterson fan too in the beginning. I mean, he's an amazing guy, and I loved his analysis of the Old Testament and what he was standing for. I remember the dark web. That was a thing that was there for a
The
while.
intellectual dark web. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. But it turned out it was a closed circle. It was just the same people over and over, and they would just reinforce each other's view, and the whole thing kind of just went away. And Jordan, one of the things that he would say about Western history, and so like we look at Nazism, and everybody says that's really bad. Well, Stalin was just as bad, if not even worse, if you want to go by pure body count.
Yep.
And then, yes, that's very true, deserves to be looked at. But then something shifted. He became more identified with the dogmatic right. And I feel that he started, the clicks or would it be popular, or he knew the people that liked him. And he became very pro-Putin in some ways, who's big hero, one of his, who's bringing back, restoring the reputation of Stalin that was completely done away with. I was in Moscow in 2014, and you could find no, except in the undergrounds, you'd find some communist signs, hammer and sickle and stuff like that. But in the Great Art Museum, there was no art that covered that really, really important part of their history. Well, he is coming back, and that his support of obviously a really bloody, dictator is what happened. What is it's just this internet thing? Is it the pressures that are brought by opinions of others, or I'm not really sure, but and his lack of moral kind of, I guess, outrage, or just saying, Trump, is doing really bad things. And I think I heard him say recently that Trump was like a 13-year-old bully. That's about his stage of development. But it was not done with any juice behind it. It was just kind of putting it out there. Mm-hmm. Whereas in other things, he's very very adamant, and very rightfully so in most cases. I've just watched his progression and noticed that I don't listen to him very much anymore unless he comes up through something else. And I was hurt by that, and I thought he was better than that. And I don't know how that exactly implies, but what do you feel about that, Keith?
Well, I think it's a great segue into critical race theory. So, I think critical race theory is a theory born of this postmodern point of view, this postmodern discernment, which says that disparities between groups, one group in power, one group out of power, the in-group has more status, wealth, access, jobs, right, whatever, than the out-group. Critical race theory says the cause of that is power and oppression. And Peterson talks about that, right? That's sort of the foundation of Marxism in a lot of ways, which became Leninism, which became the whole movement of tearing down the proletariat and all this other stuff, right? Or a tribalism that only looks at class and doesn't look at anything else would be sort of another way to critique Marxism. And Peterson's right in that he sees the tribalistic elements of critical race theory and ties it over to Marxism, and then looks at the horrors that Marxism created, Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong and all these other things, right? So what I would propose is really very simple. If we take everything we said about DEI and the places where it sees things with some degree, perhaps, of accuracy, or if not accuracy, at least it sees there's a subtle thing that's happening that may be problematic. And then we look at things and we say, okay, so for instance, we look at the STEM fields and we say 80% of people are men and 20% are women. This seems like it could be a problem. This could be caused by oppression and power and overt or subtle misogyny that's happening. And we need to consider that very seriously, because if that's happening, we want to address it and we want to fix it, obviously. I mean, obviously, right? The trouble is, if you only have the tool of critical race theory, which a lot of DEI folks do, it's the only explanatory tool in their toolbox. And so what that means is, the way I explain that difference between 80% men and 20% women, the only thing that's allowed is power and oppression, which means, okay, systemic and systematic sexism is afoot, so we have to do everything to turn it on its head. But then the trouble in that example is, I mentioned this before, but 25 years ago, 80% of people in STEM were men and 20% were women. And today, 80% are men and 20% were women. And a lot of well-meaning liberals and academics and tech companies like Google and Meta have been fighting like hell to get those percentages up. But the only way they can do it is by quality of outcomes, by basically forcing women into these jobs, because 20% of graduates in STEM fields are women and 80% are men. So is there really a surprise that this imbalance exists? And so the trouble with critical race theory is it presumes that differentiation can't be because the free and open choice of women. It can only be because of oppressive, patriarchal, misogynistic mindsets that must be obliterated, abolished, outlawed.
And I said in many cases that may be true. Exactly what you're saying there. In a lot of cases.
That's right. I mean, so the idea is if CRT is a tool, not the tool in the DEI toolbox, because does overt sexism exist in places? Of course it does. Does overt racism? Does subtle racism, subtle sexism exist? Of course. We want to be vigilant to these things because we don't want to live in a culture where that stuff's going on, you know? Wives, sisters, mothers, you know, it's like, I love women. I don't want to see them hurt in culture or denied opportunities or with people of color or people because of their gender identity, right? It's like, you know, I would fight against all of that stuff and do fight against that stuff. But we have to make sure that we're actually addressing a problem that exists. Otherwise, it's a fight that can never be won, right? We're never going to get 50% of people in the STEM fields in the next generation to be women unless we force it that way from the outside in. Equality of outcomes, which could be very destructive and problematic and be at the expense of what women actually want. Right? What are we going to force women to be engineers? You know, when they want to go into healthcare? Yeah, that doesn't seem very intelligent or compassionate to me. So
maybe we should just say a little bit about the relationship between DEI, which has been the central focus of our discussion so far, and critical race theory and critical theory in general, more broadly. And that is that in many ways, critical theory has been the fountainhead or the conceptual fountainhead from which DEI has sprung. Mm-hmm. And that critical theory came out of postmodernism rising, beginning in the kind of around the 60s maybe, and looking at multiple perspectives, being alert to subtle contradictions and dysfunctions and inequalities, etc. And out of that sprang critical theory, which was the assumption, which was pretty basically the way I understand it, and please add to it or correct, Keith, was critical theory was the arising of an intellectual movement which looked at society in very critical terms to identify inequalities and subversive power that were not being recognized, with the idea of unveiling these dysfunctional dynamics, the dysfunctional way power operated in society, and by revealing it, undo it, was the theory. And it was very much a central theme was the assumption, not just of Marxism, that there were inequalities between classes, but a much broader based understanding of power. That power was built on the ideas of the French philosopher Foucault. That power was really operated in like a kind of dynamic system that permeated all culture and society, and it was universal. And it feels very much similar in a way to the point you made about Freud, that for Freud, it was like everything can be explained in terms of sex. Well, in critical theory, everything can be explained in terms of power.
That's right.
Which is not to deny in any way that power is important and it's one crucial dynamic in society, or that it can be deployed very unfairly and unjustly. But it became an overriding concern with or belief in power as operating universally, permeating culture, distorting all interactions, even down to very minor interactions between individuals, and almost everything was to be explained in terms of power and power differentials. So I think there's a term for this, which is intellectual extravagance, where there's a tendency to explain everything in terms of a particular idea or concept. I think that's what we see here, and I would call it the single cause fallacy. That the assumption that power explains it all. And if there's one thing we have learned from big picture theories like integral theory, it's that there are always, the behavior is always, quotes, overdetermined. What overdetermined means is there are multiple dynamics and situational factors and genetic and developmental and environmental, etc., that go into determining any behavior. So at its core, it feels like critical theory really identified something very important, very crucial, inequality and the power dynamics underlying it, but fell into what feels like a very common human trap or a psychological trap, perhaps particularly common at certain stages of development, of a kind of dichotomous thinking or a single cause thinking, trying to explain everything in terms of one one idea and one dynamic. So I wasn't planning on that spiel, but there it was. So Keith, please take off from there. And
good job, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. You know, I mean, I think the idea. So a couple things come up. One is that I talked earlier about the idea of Kenyans and marathons, right? And the idea that Kenyans dominate marathons, and they dominate marathons. If someone was looking through critical theory and they were really strong advocates of that point of view, they would look first and foremost for how Kenyans are rigging the game and gaining unfair advantage, because that's what they believe to be true almost everywhere all the time. And you know, so why are Kenyans so good at winning marathons? Well, because they cheat, basically. You know, it's an old Kenyan club that's going on there. That's, you know, and of course it's a stupid example, and it's a ridiculous example, and it's transparently so. But it just points out that people who really take on critical theory wholeheartedly, they underemphasize or even are unwilling to look at like other cultural, behavioral, genetic, you know, and other factors that can influence all kinds of things. And, you know, Jordan Peterson has done a great job of, I think, elucidating that for some of these secondary sex characteristics that we find in men versus women and these really high achieving cultural roles like CEOs or mixed martial arts fighters, when you push out to the people that are willing and able to perform at the very top level of what a human being can do. If it's a CEO, that means working, you know, 100, 115 hours a week, doing one task single-mindedly to achieve a single result at the expense of everything else in your life. Or if we take the best fighters in the world, right? It's the same thing. You tend to get on a bell curve, and at the far edges of that bell curve, we tend to find a lot of men mostly. Mm-hmm. Those men outcompete other men, and they certainly outcompete women. And so Peterson makes sort of the argument that the presumption of critical race or critical theory here, the presumption of oppression and power, is just inaccurately from a sort of a purely biological standpoint, that we have to look at the data that shows that culture has been set up, rightly or wrongly, in a way that people who are the outliers on some of these bell curves get heavily rewarded for it, and those people tend to be men, not because of oppression, but because of capacity, right? I can't be a CEO. I would never be able to be a CEO. I don't have the temperament. I don't have the drive. I don't have the single-mindedness. You know, I'm not denied that position because of my gender. I'm denied that position because of my capacity. And we could make an argument that, you know, maybe society needs to evolve to where we can reward people who aren't these biological outliers, and that would serve a lot of things. And I think it would serve a lot of things if we were to evolve things to where more, you know, quote unquote feminine principles were actually rewarded in the marketplace. And that might help to address some of the meta crises that are happening all over the place around us. That's a different argument. But to your point, Roger, yeah, it's you know, if that's your hammer, and that's the only hammer you have, then every nail you hit, right, is going to be hit with this thing of power and oppression, whether it's true or not.
And is every power necessarily bad? You know,
That's
if
a
it's
great
either
point.
power or powerlessness, there's got to be good power. And I come from a very progressive background, very left most of my life, adult life anyway. And Ken Wilber one time said, and this was kind of whacked a sacred cow that I was into at the time. And he said, corporations aren't bad. Bad corporations are bad. I was like, oh, okay. And there you go. And I'm a CEO of a very small company, but I'm probably lousy at it because I'm just not driven in all the ways that would be kind of the bad power. But yeah, it's oppressive power that's bad. Bad power is bad, and good power is good. And what do we do with that? How do we become powerful in a way that is life sustaining and the good, the true, the beautiful? That expresses those values. And it's okay to be powerful if it's, the right place, the right time, and the right way.
Yeah, and power will be interpreted also at different developmental levels, of course, right? So that's part of it as well. There's nothing wrong with the fundamentalist wanting to convert people to what they know to be true. That Allah's the one and only God, that Christ is the one and only God, that Jehovah is the one and only God. Or to fund organizations that try to get those truths into the world. This is part of the challenge and the opportunity of coming out of a postmodern point of view and coming into an integral one, where we can see the beauty of the partial truth with which they see the world. Or the atheistic philosopher, who believes that religion and spirituality are just epiphenomena of the brain, and a denial of the harsh reality that we are all just materialistic lumps of matter with no purpose or meaning. That has its own beauty and its own claim to truth. Or the postmodern point of view that we're in an interconnected web of life where everything is connected to everything else. Also partially true. Also worth honoring. And or the integral point of view, where we begin to see that all these things, all these truths are partial, or even the partialness of the view as I'm speaking right now is by definition so very partial, so very limited, so incapable of actually grasping and appreciating the infinite arising of reality in this moment, which is undifferentiated, which is completely vast, utterly empty, right? And totally beyond human comprehension, except in the deepest reaches of spiritual insight, at which point the duality of language utterly fails. And so for me, it's a move always towards the humility of giving everybody the benefit of the doubt that they do have a portion of the truth. And they may just need help connecting their portion of the truth with their heart. And if we can do that, I think we can save ourselves a lot of pain and turmoil.
Wow, that was so beautifully said, Keith. The acknowledgement of the possibility of experiencing something much faster than we usually are let in, and acknowledging that experience is so vast, so mysterious, so profound that there's no way we can map it into our little brains and and fit it into our miserable little categories and make arguments about it that have real validity. But that from that perspective, we can at least appreciate the mystery and beauty and profundity of each human being, and that everyone is take a non-cynical, honoring perspective of people. That people, one can take entirely different perspectives. So much of the postmodern and the critical theory and even DEI is the assumption that people is a cynical assumption about people, pessimistic. But there's this possibility of just, looking at the reality that behavior is overdetermined. There are many motives, and one motive is everyone's trying to do the best they can.
Everybody cares.
Yeah.
The MAGA people care, the Nazis cared, Stalin cared, right? I mean, like everybody cares. And if you can touch into the care and honor the care, you can
Yeah.
question the means by which they are expressing that care.
Beautiful.
Always, always, right? But to presume that one of the mistakes of the culture wars is to presume the MAGA people don't care about the environment. MAGA people don't care about transgender people.
Yeah.
Like those are all just vicious projections, and they're not true. They do care. They just care about different things. But consensus and change comes from being willing to listen to what they care about and finding space to honor that, right? A MAGA person says, I really care about American values and about freedom and about my right to free speech or whatever it might be. But it's like, oh yeah, like I hear your care, like I feel your care, and
Yeah.
I want to honor that, and uh, and it's a place to start a real dialogue in any of these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That feels like, sorry, go on, John.
Yeah, I just want to share this, and I hope this is not virtue signaling, but I hope it's not, and I don't think it is, but I'll risk it. Um, Here where I'm living in the South, and in a city with 6% African American, and anyway, the reasons I ended up here. But there was a young man just gotten married who lived. It's a neighbor of ours. He lived in an apartment that we have. And he had come from a very lower class white background, had drug problems, had been to prison, and he just was born again, in a real sincere way. And he wanted to go to school to become a minister. So I agreed to pay his tuition and books, in a way he never could have. So he ended up going to an all-black seminary, the only white guy, and coming out, I mean, with so much respect and love for his fellow students, and he came from a very, redneck, this or that, Confederate flag type of thing. And just went to his graduation. And it's an amazing guy. And I've never talked about integral or spiral dynamics or this or that. I've just been with him on the level that he's at because I have a background in that type of Christianity myself. So I can speak to that. I can speak to the Bible, and I've just tried to, be with him there. And now he's gone on to grad school. And I said, well, okay, how about if I pay half your bills from now? And he goes, oh, yeah, thank you so much. God bless you. Really appreciate it. So it's just an example. I had an opportunity to do some good that for somebody who's not exactly on my level, whatever that means, who doesn't see the world in an integral way, but was a very healthy expression of blue, amber, traditional, wanting to serve, wanting to love, and wanting and his hunger for learning is so amazing. And I helped him with some stuff, and it was like really just some really sophisticated stuff they were teaching, even though it was from a traditional evangelical point of view. So if we can respect people where they're at, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would ask you, Keith, given what you delineated and made very clear about the problems from kind of our home base, which being progressive and liberal. What do we do now? Do you see I mean, a general kind of way out that we can turn things around and make a difference in our radically divided and dangerous situation that we live in, not only in our country, but
Sure.
it's happening all over the world.
Yeah. I mean, we have conversations like this, right?
Yeah.
Be willing to plant a stake in the ground and stand for something, right? So it's like, and I do this in all kinds of ways. I think I mentioned this before, but there are little ways that I can talk to some of my well-meaning DEI friends, of whom I have a lot. But when they say things like, well, we welcome everybody, we welcome all points of view, and that's one of the places where I'll very gently say, well, can I challenge you a little bit on that? And they'll say, what do you mean? I said, well, You don't really welcome all points of view, because if you did, then you would welcome Nazis into your group, which you obviously wouldn't welcome. So I would invite you to define what you mean when you say we welcome all points of view, because it's actually not true. And you create a situation where you may be projecting certain things onto the group that you might not be aware of. So little conversations like that for me help to move the ball forward a little bit in a million little ways. And also, like, people will say things like, respecting all people, and I learned this from a friend of mine, Rosalind Weissman, who's a brilliant author. But she makes this great discernment between respect, because, high schools and grade schools will teach, you should respect everybody. And she says, it's absurd. Respect is earned. I'm not going to respect you because you're human, but I will agree that all humans are worthy of a certain level of dignity, of human dignity. There I'll get on board. Respect, you know what? I think you're a bit of a wanker. I actually don't respect you at all, but I will treat you with dignity. And she makes that discernment, which I think is a really healthy distinction. And I think really what we're talking about with these kinds of conversations and these kinds of things is helping ourselves and helping others to make these healthy discernments, because without them, we open up to this projection that can happen that can continue to divide us against ourselves unnecessarily.
Beautiful, Keith. And one of the real gifts you've brought to this conversation and to your work in the whole cultural criticism arena, and specifically DEI, is a combination of deep respect for the people who are in these movements, a recognition of the underlying idealism, and avoidance of black and white thinking. And and the way I see what you're trying to do is to create a more diverse, a more equitable and fair, and a more inclusive movement.
Absolutely. It's DEI all the way.
Yes. It
just includes conservatives, and it includes integralists, and it includes even fundamentalists, right? Like, all welcome at the table.
Yeah. And again, as we come to the end here, just to acknowledge the ground from which you are taking this stance. And I just loved what you said about the recognition of the profundity and vastness and mystery of the world and the universe we live in, the incomprehensibility, the impossibility of putting into our little ideas. And from that stance, recognizing that everyone's an expression of that mystery, everyone's trying to do the best they can. And with that recognition, then we can approach people with very different ideas and with dignity, as you just said, and appreciation, and engage in caring conversation. I think you've been a model of that in our dialogue, and it's just been a lot of fun and very informative. I have to say, I've been kind of trying to just keep track with the incredible number of ideas you've downloaded in a brief time. It's been really inspiring and educational for me, and I'm sure for everyone who's listening. So, Keith, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the work and the thought that you put into this. It's a gift to us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do really appreciate that. And it's just so important to me that we all hold these discussions and these opinions, as you said, Roger, with just a lot of humility, right? It's like, I know that I am wrong on a number of points that I made today. It'll take me some time to figure it out, but it's just holding all this and holding ourselves with some levity. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing.
Indeed. Enlightenment is lightening up. May it be so. Keith, thank you so much. What a gift you've given us all. All the best for your good work.
Thank you so much.